Hey guys, tonight we're heading way out, past the trails, past the towns, into the deep cold of the Northwoods. Imagine yourself stepping off a creaking sleigh into waist-deep snow, surrounded by towering pine and spruce that blot out half the sky. The wind is slicing through your jacket like it's made of wet tissue. Welcome to your new home, a 19th century logging camp. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I always wonder who's tuning in from the warm beaches of Florida while we're freezing off limbs in this forest hellscape. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been hired as a greenhorn, a fresh recruit to one of the roughest jobs in North America. Logging the frozen wilderness isn't just dangerous, it's borderline absurd. You're handed a double-bit axe and pointed toward the tree line. But before you can even think about work, there's the small matter of not freezing to death. No one told you your housing would be a glorified snow cave with a tarp nailed over it. It's your first night, and the temperature's hovering somewhere between shiver and cry silently. You're crammed shoulder to shoulder in a makeshift lean-to with 3 other guys who smell like sweat and wet wool. The ground is frozen solid. Your blanket is one threadbare wool sheet. Every time you move, cold air sneaks in and slaps your skin like it's personally offended you exist. A historical fact for you. This was real. By the mid-1800s, lumber camps exploded across the northern U.S. and Canada, especially in places like Maine, Michigan, and Ontario. Camps moved with the seasons, setting up in the deep woods where the best timber stood. These camps weren't luxurious. Most of them started just like this, hastily built shelters, or even tents, before proper bunkhouses were constructed. You lie awake, listening to the wind clawing at the tarp. Snow drifts in through the seams and dusts your boots. Someone to your left is snoring like a buzzsaw. To your right, a man is muttering in French between shivers. Above you, the night sky crackles with stars, utterly uninterested in whether you live or freeze. Welcome to bunkhouse life, day one. And here's the quirky detail. Some of these early camps had a guy called the bull cook, and while he wasn't the cook, his job was to keep the fire alive, the water buckets full, and the floors swept. But unofficially, he was also the closest thing to Camp Mom. He might wake you up by throwing your boots at you or insult your snoring until you rolled over. It wasn't glamorous, but in a place where frostbite and hypothermia were daily threats, that one cranky man with a broom might just save your life. You're regretting this gig already. You were promised hearty meals, strong coffee, and manly camaraderie. What you've got is cold stew, weak coffee, and a guy named Big Tom who just used your sleeping spot as a boot bench. By morning, your joints ache like you aged 40 years overnight. Your breath puffs out like a smoke signal, and you've barely slept a wink. Here's the debate among historians. Some argue that these early camps were more organized than we give them credit for. Letters and journals from the time mention coordinated teams, timber marking systems, and even payrolls run on the honor system. Others insist it was chaos. Whoever had the biggest axe and loudest voice made the rules, and the rest of you just tried to avoid losing fingers. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. Organized chaos, frozen anarchy, all of it under the same tarp. The morning bell, or more likely a frying pan smacked against a log, signals that it's time to get up. You're groggy, cold, and mildly confused about why your beard has frozen to your collar. The cook shack smells like scorched bread and burnt bacon. You inhale both like it's gourmet. And you wonder how many months or years it will take before a real bunkhouse gets built. One old-timer tells you it happens every season. First, the scouts find the right patch of woods. Then comes the lean-to era, a cold, miserable prelude. Finally, when enough timber has been cut to clear some space, the real building starts, an actual bunkhouse with walls and windows and maybe even a stove. Until then, it's you, the tarp, and the fire you pray doesn't go out. And yet, in some weird sleep-deprived way, it's kind of magical. The night was brutal, sure, but in the pre-dawn stillness, the forest glows blue and silver. Ice coats every branch like glass. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaks. Your breath is smoke, your boots crunch through fresh powder, and you're alive. You made it through the first night, which means you might make it through the second, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live long enough to see a proper bunkhouse go up. You wake up sore in places you didn't know you had. Your breath still fogs in front of you, even though the sun's been up for an hour. It's your second day, and your muscles already feel like they've declared mutiny. Someone slaps a mug of coffee into your hand, boiled to the consistency of motor oil, black as chimney soot. No one talks much in the morning. The men trudge around the camp like stiff-limbed shadows, layered in wool and misery. There's a strange sense of unspoken agreement here. You do the work, you keep moving, you try not to die. Nobody has the energy to pretend otherwise. You step outside the cook shack into the snow, and your breath catches, not from beauty, but from cold that reaches down your throat and strangles you. The trees creak and groan in the wind, tall and heavy with snow, like they're gossiping about how short your life expectancy is. Today's assignment isn't to cut trees. Not yet. You're on structure duty, which sounds promising until you realize that means building your own shelter. It's time to start the real bunkhouse. The idea is simple. Stack logs until it resembles something sleepable. The execution? Not so simple. First, you need logs, and not the kind lying around like sleeping puppies. No, you're felling fresh trees for this, cutting them down by hand, peeling the bark, notching the ends. Each log has to be fitted like puzzle pieces, except if puzzles weighed 300 pounds and gave you splinters the size of pencils. The first few hours are mostly chopping and cursing. One of the senior loggers, whose name might be Joe or might just be Old Guy, shows you how to notch a log properly. Not like that, he says, every time you swing your axe. Like this. His version is cleaner, faster, and makes you feel like a toddler with a plastic hammer. But slowly, under his growls and guidance, you start to get it. The logs begin to stack. Rough walls rise from the snow like something out of a fever dream. It's crooked. It leans slightly west, but it's yours. You're building it. And with any luck, you won't freeze in it. Here's your historical fact. Most bunkhouses followed a pretty predictable design by the late 1800s. They were long, single-room cabins, often around 20 to 30 feet wide and 40 to 60 feet long, depending on the crew size. The roof was low-pitched to shed snow, and ventilation was minimal, mostly on purpose to keep heat in, but also because no one cared if it got smoky as long as it stayed warm. Walls were made of hand-hewn logs, notched and stacked, sometimes chinked with moss, clay, or anything that would fill the gaps. You reach for another log and immediately regret the way your back protests. A few guys joke that the rookie's arms will fall off by lunch. You're not convinced they're wrong. Someone slips on a patch of ice and lands with a crunch that echoes through the trees. Thankfully, more ego than bone was bruised. Still, it's a reminder. One wrong step out here, and you're in real trouble. There's no hospital, no ambulance. There's a tin of bear grease, a dirty bandage, and maybe some whiskey. That's your urgent care. Now for the weird bit. Some camps didn't just build one bunkhouse. They built entire little villages. A bunkhouse, a cook shack, a blacksmith hut, even ice houses for storing meat through the spring. One camp in Minnesota supposedly had a tiny barber shop run by a guy who only knew one haircut. Off. You needed a full head of hair in this cold, but after weeks of lice and grease, even baldness started to look appealing. You finally reach the point where the walls are shoulder high, and someone starts rigging a ridgepole for the roof. It's made from a whole peeled trunk balanced between two forked timbers. You help hoist it with numb fingers, your breath coming in short, steamy bursts. The cold is so deep it feels personal now, like it's testing you. The snow is falling again, lazy, slow flakes that flutter into your collar and melt with just enough warmth to make your spine shiver. There's an argument brewing about the roof angle. One guy insists it needs a steeper pitch to shed snow. Another says that wastes heat. You're too tired to pick a side, but it's fascinating watching grown men nearly come to blows over architecture, as if any of you are trained carpenters. In truth, most lumberjacks were farm boys, immigrants, or men running from something. There were French Canadians, Swedes, Irishmen, and the occasional quiet guy from nowhere who never gave his last name. And here's where the scholars disagree again. Some historians argue these men formed strong bonds over time, becoming makeshift families. Others say the bunkhouse was more like a powder keg, full of short fuses and long grudges. Both views are probably right. The truth depends on the crew, the weather, and how many nights the stew had bones in it. As the light fades, the bunkhouse in progress begins to look almost livable. The log walls are up. The frame for the roof is in place. Tomorrow you'll start laying the cedar planks across the beams. Then cover that with spruce boughs, tar paper, or whatever else you can find to keep the wind out. You're exhausted, but there's pride in your sweat. You helped raise a structure that might just keep your toes attached through the winter. Night comes fast out here, and with it, that plunging cold again. For now, it's back to the lean-to. But this time, you fall asleep with the ghost of a roof in your mind and a sense that survival might not be a completely ridiculous idea after all. You wake to the sound of hammering, not distant and polite, but right in your skull, sharp and steady. At first you think it's a hangover from yesterday's exhaustion, but no, it's literal hammering. Someone's already back at work on the bunkhouse, and you've slept late, which means later than the others, which still feels like 5 a.m. You roll off your straw mattress, knees popping like dry twigs, and shuffle out into the snow, still half buttoned into your coat. The air hits your face like it's angry at you for daring to be warm for even a second. The sun's barely up, a smear of dull orange behind the trees, and the bunkhouse is looking a little more like a cabin and a little less like a pile of sticks. The roof frame's complete now, and today's task is laying down the roof itself. That means clambering up a frosty ladder made of knotted spruce limbs while balancing boards and tools like a circus act. Congratulations! You're now a roofer. The boards creak under your weight. Your gloves are stiff with ice. Your breath fogs across your vision every time you exhale. You crouch, awkward and tense, on the edge of the rising roof as someone below shouts instructions that sound helpful, but are really just variations of "don't screw it up." You nod as if you know what you're doing, while your inner monologue is screaming something about OSHA violations and how this was never in the job description. Here's a fact. Most lumber camp bunkhouses weren't built to last more than a season or two. They were what you'd call temporary permanents, slapped together with muscle and improvisation, meant to weather the worst of winter and then be abandoned as the logging crew moved on. Still, despite the slapdash construction, there was a real rhythm to how these places went up. You'd start with the corners, saddle-notched logs if you had the time and talent, or just square notches if you were in a rush, and then layer up the walls. A team of 3 to 4 men could frame a full bunkhouse in a couple of weeks, assuming frostbite didn't take any fingers in the process. Back on the roof, you hammer in a board with such force that your arm goes numb from wrist to shoulder. You shake it off. Below you, someone's complaining about the chimney angle. Yes, there will be a stove. No, you're not sure if the chimney will be crooked forever. Everything here leans a little. It's part of the charm. As you climb down for a break, you're handed a tin mug of something pretending to be soup. It's warm, salty, and tastes vaguely like tree bark. You slurp it down anyway, grateful for the heat. The man who gave it to you is called Limp George, which you suspect is not his birth name. He used to be a railroad brakeman until something went sideways with a steel coupling and his leg never quite recovered. Now he builds bunkhouses in the woods and tells stories that may or may not be true. Like the one about the bunkhouse that got buried in a single night of snow, trapping the whole crew inside until spring. You laugh, a little too nervously. And here's the quirky thing. Some camps had traditions around how the first bunkhouse was finished. In one part of Maine, it was said you had to bury a coin under the threshold for luck. In parts of Quebec, someone had to spit on the first nail driven into the roof beam to keep evil spirits out. You're not sure if it's superstition or boredom, but you find yourself eyeing your own boot for any spare change, just in case. You return to the roof just as the last planks are going up. The wind's picked up now, whistling through the trees like some ancient complaint. It tugs at your coat and freezes the sweat on your back into a crackling sheet of ice. Someone nearly loses a board over the edge, and there's a mad scramble to catch it before it plummets into the snow below. Success. Applause. One man punches the other in the arm, hard, as a sort of congratulation. This is affection, lumberjack style. A debate breaks out about insulation. Moss, birch bark, sawdust in canvas sacks. The cook yells that he's not giving up any more potato sacks. They're all full of beans, and that ends that. You opt for dried moss and pine needles, which sounds quaint until you're stuffing it into gaps with bare fingers, coughing on the dust, and trying not to think about the spider you just disturbed. Now, let's get academic. There's still debate about how much engineering skill went into these bunkhouses. Some researchers argue that the men applied regional building knowledge, Finnish log techniques, Scandinavian jointing, French-Canadian roof design, crafting a hybrid style born of cultural mashup. Others argue it was mostly brute force and necessity. If it stands up and doesn't fall down when you lean on it, it's good enough. Maybe both are true. Maybe desperation is its own form of genius. By the time the last board is nailed, the sky's gone gray. Snow begins to fall again. Steady, soft flakes like a quiet applause. You step back and take in the view. A low, narrow cabin with smoke already curling from a crude stovepipe, logs dark with melted snow, door frame hung slightly off-center but still solid. You built this. You and the rest of the cold, calloused crew. It may not look like much, but to a half-frozen lumberjack, it might as well be the Ritz. That night, you're the first one inside. The fire crackles in the stove, radiating uneven waves of heat. The floor is still dirt, but dry dirt, which feels luxurious compared to last week's frozen mud. You pick a top bunk. Bad move. You'll find out later when it's a sauna up there. And stretch out, finally horizontal in something that smells more like pine sap than wet feet. For now, anyway. The others file in, boots stomping, jackets shedding snow. The air fills with voices, laughter, complaints, and one perfectly harmonized chorus of sneezes. It's not quiet. It's not peaceful. but it's warmer, and it's yours. The bunkhouse is officially open for business and survival. There's no such thing as waking up slowly in a lumber camp bunkhouse. You don't stretch, yawn, and pad softly to a window for a warm mug of coffee. You bolt upright because someone smacked the stove too hard and sent a wave of heat across your face, or because the guy in the bunk below just launched into a coughing fit that sounds like a diesel engine trying to die. Or maybe it's because your shoulder is frozen to the wall and pulling away from it feels like ripping off a Band-Aid made of skin and regrets. It's still dark. It's always dark in the mornings. The only light is the flicker of the wood stove, glowing like a tired jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. You climb down from your bunk, misjudge the last step, and land in something that squishes. It might be a sock. It might be a mouse. You don't ask. Someone grunts at you to shut the door, then realizes the door isn't open, and the cold is just coming in through the floorboards. Welcome to day 4. The floor, in case you're curious, is a masterpiece of compromise. It's made of roughly hewn planks that don't quite match and definitely don't seal. There are gaps wide enough to lose a spoon, or a small toe if you're not careful. The cold seeps up like it's hunting you, curling around your ankles before the fire has a chance to reach them. A few clever guys have started stuffing the gaps with sawdust and moss, but it's a losing battle. The floor is always cold, always damp, always there to remind you that even inside, the forest is watching. Now, historically speaking, some camps actually tried to do better. In parts of Canada and northern New England, loggers would line the floor with thick bark strips or raise the entire cabin on short stilts to avoid meltwater pooling beneath it. Others layered straw or pine boughs directly onto the dirt, a kind of rustic rug that smelled like Christmas and mildew. You've got uneven boards and the lingering smell of boiled socks. And speaking of smell, have you noticed it yet? It hits you like a wet blanket around the 3rd or 4th day, when the charm of pine walls and wood smoke gives way to something earthier. It's a heady mix of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tobacco juice, wet boots, and the unmistakable scent of desperation. Someone always tries to hang a shirt near the stove to dry it out, which only adds the perfume of scorched flannel to the bouquet. You wonder if it's possible to get nose fatigue, or if your brain just gives up trying to process the tragedy of smells. As you dress, layer after layer of scratchy wool, you take a moment to admire the insulation efforts. The bunkhouse walls are packed with a glorious mix of anything you could find: moss, strips of animal hide, bark, even one guy's ruined long johns. Desperate times, desperate textiles. The chinking looks like it was done by a drunken raccoon, but it holds. Mostly. There's still one crack near the ceiling that howls every time the wind picks up. And let's not forget the fringe innovation of the day: moose hair. Yes, that's right. Some camps gathered the coarse hair shed by moose during the fall and used it as insulation padding. Supposedly, it was excellent for trapping heat. Supposedly. What no one mentions is that moose hair has a particular odor when warmed by fire, one that can best be described as burnt barn. It's currently wafting through the upper bunks like a cologne designed to repel joy. Breakfast is a blur. Cold beans, hot tea, bread so dense it could be used as roofing. You scarf it down while one hand fumbles with your boots, which you left too close to the fire last night and are now just stiff, smoldering leather shells. As you jam your feet in, you hear the telltale sound: creaking timbers, groaning roof beams, the faint crackle of ice shifting overhead. It's just the cold playing its usual tricks, but the sound never stops being unnerving. Like the whole place is sighing, exhausted, just like you. The debate of the morning, because there's always one, is about whether the bunkhouse needs a second stove. The current one works okay. It throws heat, sure, but only in a 10-foot radius. If you're near it, you're sweating bullets. If you're in the corner, you're basically a human popsicle. Some guys argue that a second stove would even things out. Others say that would just make twice the smoke and take up valuable space better used for sock drying. No one agrees. Everyone complains. No one does anything. Classic bunkhouse democracy. And here's your historical tidbit to chew on while you watch someone try to patch a roof leak with a biscuit tin lid. Many bunkhouses were built with a raised platform along the walls instead of separate beds. Everyone slept side by side, shoulder to shoulder, like logs on a shelf. Think of it as a communal mattress made of itchy blankets and resentment. Bunks, when they came into fashion, were usually double or triple stacked, with a ladder that no one used because climbing it was just asking to fall on your face in front of 20 judgmental men. Some scholars argue that this close-quarters lifestyle forged intense bonds between lumberjacks. They became a brotherhood forged in sweat, snow, and splinters. Others point out the steady rate of broken noses, chipped teeth, and midnight brawls, suggesting that maybe bonding is a generous interpretation. You're beginning to see both sides. Last night, someone sneezed so loudly it woke half the cabin, and then refused to admit it. A minor war nearly broke out until the cook threw a boot and told everyone to shut up or go sleep in the snow. Still, there's a weird comfort in it all. The sound of 20 men breathing, snoring, shifting, mumbling in their sleep, the rustle of blankets, the creak of the stove expanding, the occasional belch, which somehow feels like punctuation. In a way, the bunkhouse becomes its own living thing. Not quite a home, but close. A shelter made not just of logs and moss, but of shared misery, bad jokes, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow will be just as hard, and you'll all face it together, frost-bitten toes and all. And as you sit down on your crooked bunk, rubbing your hands over the stove-warmed tin mug and feeling the heat finally reach your bones, you look around and realize it may be freezing, it may stink, and it may be wildly unsafe, but somehow this ramshackle wooden box in the middle of nowhere is starting to feel like survival. You're not sure when it hits you. Maybe it's the third night in a row where someone's elbow finds your ribs, or maybe it's the morning your bunkmate rolls over and plants a wool-covered foot directly in your face. But the truth sneaks up on you like frost creeping through a window seam. This bunkhouse was never built for comfort. It was built for containment, human storage. The loggers here are packed in like firewood, stacked and sorted, one atop another, in bunks that make you question how much dignity a person really needs to survive the winter. The bunks are arranged 3 high along both walls, an architectural decision born from necessity and poor impulse control. First tier gets the floor chill, second tier gets drool and ash rain from above, and top tier, you, unfortunately, gets both heat and claustrophobia. You're sandwiched between the roof and your blanket like a poorly stuffed sausage. You can't sit up without cracking your skull on the ceiling. Every breath brings in a noseful of cedar, smoke, and whatever stew spice sweat the guy below is off-gassing tonight. Personal space is not on the menu here. In theory, you each have a designated bunk. In practice, it's first come, first staked out. Most guys hold their space with something deeply personal. A hat, a battered copy of a pulp novel, a belt coiled like a rattlesnake. You've taken to leaving your gloves on the pillow, an unspoken signal that says, mine. Don't test me. It mostly works. Except for that one guy who seems to think everything is communal, including your blanket. You're going to have words with him. Later. Maybe. Historically, Lumber camp bunkhouses didn't just pack in a handful of men. They packed in 20, 30, sometimes 50 souls into one long wooden room. That meant rows of bunks with barely enough space between them to swing a leg over. Some camps used canvas hammocks instead of beds, strung in layers across the rafters like an old ship's quarters. Others had wall-to-wall sleeping platforms, one wide mattress more or less, where everyone curled up in lines like spoons in a drawer. Think slumber party, but with more injuries and lice. And yes, that's your fringe fact of the day: lice. No matter how many layers of wool you wear, no matter how many times you boil your clothes or dust your scalp with wood ash, the lice will find you. They are relentless. They are eternal. One old logger tells you he once watched a bunkhouse floor shimmer like water when everyone dropped their shirts at the same time. You pretend to laugh. Later, you scratch your scalp with suspicion and pray to every forest god that he's exaggerating. At night, the bunkhouse becomes a concert hall of human noise. Snores rise in waves, a shifting ocean of nasal terror. Coughs echo off the log walls like gunshots. Someone mumbles in their sleep about pancakes. Someone else lets out a string of words you're fairly sure are either German curses or mating calls. There's always at least one guy who grinds his teeth like a rock polisher. By now, you've trained yourself to sleep through most of it, though the occasional sleep fart still has the power to launch you straight into fight or flight mode. And then there's the smell. Not just the ambient stink of men marinating in their own wool, but the slow fermentation of boots, socks, and unwashed bedding. The top bunks, blessed by heat, also become drying racks for everything wet, which means your nose is pressed directly into a jungle of steaming socks, damp mittens, and one pair of long johns that haven't seen daylight since the last presidential election. You try to breathe through your mouth, it doesn't help. By day, the bunkhouse is less crowded. Men scatter to their jobs, felling trees, skidding logs, loading sleighs. But by night, the room fills again with boots and bodies. The narrow aisles between bunks turn into an obstacle course of gear and elbows. A wrong step means an accidental stomp on someone's foot, followed by an argument about who owns what and whose boots are leaking goat grease. There's a hierarchy, unofficial, but deeply enforced. Senior guys get first pick of bunks, the warmest spots near the stove. Rookies like you get the bunks that creak and wobble and smell vaguely of rodent. And here's the scholarly debate of the day. Did these crowded conditions promote camaraderie or chaos? Some argue that the forced intimacy created a strong team dynamic. You fought together, worked together, slept side by side. Others argue it fostered resentment, especially when tensions ran high or food ran low. Diaries from the era include equal parts fondness and fury. Old Pete snores like a dying bear, but saved my life when I fell in the river. Or, I'd share a bunk with Joe again if he'd stop stealing my damn tobacco. It's a mixed bag. Like every other part of this frozen circus, one night, you wake up with a hand in your face. Not metaphorically, an actual hand. You blink and realize your bunkmate has rolled over in his sleep and punched through the thin layer of blanket separating you. He doesn't stir. You push his arm back over the edge like you're returning a borrowed broom. This happens more often than you'd like. Personal boundaries are theoretical at best. You've learned to sleep with your arms crossed and one eye open. And yet, somehow, it's working. You're not dead. You're not warm, not rested, not particularly clean, but you're alive. The bunkhouse might be a sensory assault of noise, heat, stink, and elbows, but it's shelter. It's survival. It's something between a barracks and a barn, but it keeps the wolves out and the wind off your bones. One evening, you watch the snow fall from your narrow window slit. just a crack in the wall that someone lined with pig bladder to keep out drafts. Outside, it's all silence and frost. Inside, it's snoring and the hiss of steam off a boot too close to the stove. Somehow the chaos feels safer than the stillness. This packed, rattling, barely held together shack of men is the only warm thing in 1,000 miles of cold forest. You pull your blanket tighter, tuck your gloves under your head, and brace for another night in the sardine can. The fire has gone out. That's how the morning begins. Not with the clang of the cook's ladle or the muttered complaints of men fighting for clean socks, but with the bitter, bone-numbing realization that the bunkhouse stove is dead. The warmth that usually clings to the center of the room has vanished, and in its place is a cold so sharp it feels like a punishment. You sit up fast, banging your head against the bunk above. Again. At this point, you're convinced the ceiling is either getting lower or your skull is getting taller. Your breath fogs immediately, a small puff of defeat. Around you, others are stirring, slowly, stiffly, and with more profanity than usual. Someone curses the fire. Someone else blames the green firewood stacked near the stove. And someone near the far wall just yells, "Why is my boot frozen to the floor?" It's going to be one of those days. The fire, when it's working, is the beating heart of the bunkhouse. It radiates heat, sure, but it also provides light, a cooking surface, and a place to dry out your damp clothes and your worst moods. When it dies overnight, it takes morale down with it. You crawl from your bunk, half-dressed and fully grumpy, and shuffle toward the stove like a moth toward the world's most judgmental flame. Turns out the fire didn't go out completely. It's sleeping, sulking in a bed of gray ash, waiting for someone to bribe it back to life. You crouch and poke it with the iron rod, stirring up embers that glow like old coals in a blacksmith's forge. A few sparks dance up, hopeful but lazy. The wood pile beside the stove is low, again, and the logs are too fresh, again. Green wood hisses and spits when it burns. It's like trying to cook a meal over boiling lettuce. Here's your historical fact. Fire maintenance in a lumber camp wasn't just a chore. It was a matter of survival. Most camps had a designated bull cook, and among his many unglamorous duties, like sweeping floors, chopping kindling, and shooing away rodents, was the all-important task of keeping the fire lit. Day and night. If he failed, the men suffered. If he succeeded, no one noticed. Sounds about right. You and another half-awake soul start feeding the stove, splitting kindling with dull hatchets, blowing carefully into the base like you're courting the thing. Slowly, grudgingly, the fire returns. First smoke, then flame. The room brightens, not by much, but enough to chase off the creeping cold from the far corners. A collective grunt ripples through the bunkhouse as men begin moving with slightly less reluctance. Now the quirky part. Some camps, desperate to keep fires burning through the night, resorted to burning unusual things. Animal fat-soaked rags, dried dung, and even pine tar if they could get it. One legend speaks of a camp in the Yukon that used old leather harnesses and a pair of boots as emergency fuel during a blizzard. They said the fire smelled like betrayal for days. Breakfast is a little more cheerful once the stove's humming. The cooks made something resembling porridge, thick, pale, and lumpy. It tastes like survival. You eat it fast, not because it's good, but because it's hot. And heat is currency here. Someone passes around a tin of molasses. You pour a glob onto your bowl and pretend it's flavor. The stove's glow doesn't reach every bunk. In the corners, frost still clings to the walls, delicate white feathers that refuse to melt. That's a thing most folks don't realize about these bunkhouses. They weren't heated evenly. The stove blazed in the center, while the edges remained little Arctic zones. It was like living inside a gradient. If you were lucky, your bunk was on the warm side of the line. If not, you might wake to find your blanket frozen to the wall. Again. Scholars love to debate whether this uneven heating was an accident or just a consequence of necessity. Some argue that smarter camps arranged bunks in tighter circles or clustered them toward the center to trap warmth. Others claim the layout was always dictated by space. Long, narrow cabins forced long rows of bunks, whether it made sense or not. Either way, the result was the same. Men fought like wolves for the warmest spots, and the stove was king. You've seen the hierarchy up close. Guys arrive early in the season and stake their claims near the heat source. The center bunks go first, then the next row out. By the time you got here, the prime real estate was long gone. You're stuck in the back 40, near the corner that collects smoke and cold like a bad debt. Still, there are perks. You're farther from the snorers. And if the stove ever explodes, which, let's be honest, seems likely, you'll have a head start toward the door. Throughout the day, the stove becomes the center of social life. Men gather around it during breaks, swapping stories, drying gloves, spitting into the ash box. The space around it becomes a swirling mix of steam and odor, sweat, socks, and whatever died in someone's coat lining last week. You learn not to stand too close, lest you find yourself marinated in eau de Logman. One guy brings out a harmonica and wheezes a tune that sounds vaguely like a dirge. Another pulls out a whittling knife and starts carving a tiny moose from a lump of wood. He's not good, but he's determined. You sit nearby, holding your tin cup near the flame, watching a pair of socks slowly inflate as the moisture boils out of them like they're haunted. Night comes again. The stove glows fiercely, crackling and hissing with defiance. You all huddle closer than usual. The temperature's supposed to drop hard tonight. Someone says it might hit -40. You don't ask Celsius or Fahrenheit. At that point, it doesn't matter. Before climbing into your bunk, you stop at the stove, load in another log, and whisper a little prayer. Not religious, just desperate. Something like, "Please, don't die tonight." You know what it means to wake up cold. You know how long it takes to feel your toes again. You know how fast heat vanishes when it's not fed. You climb into your blanket cocoon, muscles aching, socks half dry, the stink of scorched wool lingering in your nose. The stove pops once, like a settling groan. The room flickers. And despite the noise, the crowd, the discomfort, you sleep. Because here, a working stove means everything. It means survival. It means waking up alive. You wake up with your mustache frozen to your blanket. Not in a charming holiday card kind of way, but in a stiff, crackling, my face is glued to wool situation that requires a slow, painful peel just to sit up. Your breath still fogs in front of you. And when you glance up at the ceiling, if you can call it that, considering the bunk above is a mere 16 inches from your nose, you spot it. Frost. Not just a little patch, a full constellation of hoarfrost twinkling along the underside of the roof beams like the stars came down to judge you while you slept. It happens every morning now. Warm air from 24 sleeping, snoring, coughing men rises and meets the ice-cold wood. Moisture builds, freezes, and crystallizes until the entire ceiling glitters with frosty menace. Every now and then, someone shifts in their bunk or slams the bunkhouse door, and it shakes just enough for a little snowdrift of condensation to fall. Right onto your face. You've learned to sleep slightly tilted, like a man expecting a ceiling sneeze at any moment. You slide out of your bunk and plant your feet on the freezing floor. The fire's gone to embers again. Typical. Someone grunts from across the room and throws another log in, sending a spurt of flame up into the dim, smoky air. It illuminates the ceiling, casting the frost in a golden shimmer for just a second before the smoke drifts back in and turns everything gray again. Here's your morning science fact. The frost isn't just annoying, it's a symptom of the bunkhouse's breath. All that warm, humid air from dozens of lungs creates a cycle of condensation and freezing. And with poor insulation and little ventilation, ventilation meant cold air, so nobody wanted it. You get an indoor snowstorm forming every single night. Some camps tried to combat this by drilling tiny air vents near the roofline. Others just accepted that if you weren't crusty by morning, you weren't breathing right. You stand, stretch, and promptly smack your knuckles on the rafter. They come away with splinters and a bit of frost. You don't even flinch anymore. This is life now. Minor injuries and major drafts. You tug on your stiff trousers, frozen slightly around the knees, and lace up your boots while trying to remember if that dream about a moose in a rocking chair was real or just your brain trying to warm itself with nonsense. Someone shuffles past you, trailing a blanket and muttering about the sky leaking again. You look up. Sure enough, one of the frost patches is dripping now, thanks to the heat from the stove starting to rise. A soft plop of water lands in someone's boot. He doesn't notice, or he pretends not to. Neither option is inspiring. And here's the fringe reality. Some lumberjacks took to building little frost shields above their bunks. Bits of canvas or bark angled to catch the ceiling melt before it hit their faces. Primitive canopies. One guy you know, Eli, has rigged a tin plate to the underside of the bunk above his, with a hole in one side so the drips run down into a mug. He drinks from it in the morning, proudly. Says it's sky coffee. You think he might be losing his mind. Then again, you're not so sure you haven't lost yours. There's an undeniable rhythm to the mornings now. Groaning, cursing, stoking the fire, pouring steaming water into metal basins that immediately freeze around the edges. The cook rings the breakfast bell, or more accurately, throws a dented ladle at the wall, and bodies start to move with reluctant gravity. You file out, rubbing your eyes and dodging dripping rafter bombs. Over beans and dry bread, the conversation is minimal. Not because no one has anything to say, but because everyone's mouth is half frozen and full of carbohydrates. It's just easier to grunt. But even in the silence, the frost looms. The way it creeps in overnight, the way it clings to everything, boots, blankets, your own eyelashes, it's like sharing a room with an invisible, shivering ghost. The scholarly debate here is subtle, but worth noting. Were these frost conditions purely environmental, or did the design of the bunkhouse make it worse? Some experts argue that more breathable roofing materials could have mitigated the moisture buildup. Birch bark layers, vented eaves, or even smoke holes left partly uncovered. Others argue that the sheer number of bodies in these spaces guaranteed frost, no matter what. 24 men, no real ventilation, and an overworked stove in the center? That's a condensation factory. You get back from the woods around dusk, fingers aching, axe heavier than it was this morning, boots soaked through. And what's waiting for you? The smell of the bunkhouse, rich and evolving. Damp socks steaming near the stove. A forgotten pot of something that might have been potatoes. A faint whiff of someone's pipe tobacco. Always more pleasant in theory than reality. And of course, the returning frost, already creeping back onto the walls before you can even sit down. Someone decides to have a bit of fun and jumps up to smack the frost with a broom handle. It shakes loose like a tiny avalanche, coating half the bunkhouse in a layer of sparkly slush. The cook shouts something that sounds like a threat involving boiling water and rope. Everyone laughs, too tired to care about being cold, too numb to remember what dry feels like. There's a certain joy in it, weirdly enough, a shared sense of suffering. You look around at the other faces, tired and pink-nosed, and realize something. Nobody survives this alone. You're not just bunkmates. You're Frost brothers now. As you crawl into bed that night, you notice the frost is forming in new patterns, little spider webs of ice stretching across the corner post. You try not to think about what that means. The wind howls outside, the bunkhouse creaks in response, and your blanket has frozen into a light crust near the edges. You pull it tighter anyway. The guy in the bunk below you mutters something about putting a shoe on his head for warmth. You want to mock him, but honestly he might be onto something. And just before sleep grabs you, your breath fogging in the air like a slow ghost, you wonder, will tomorrow's frost be worse? Or will you wake up soaked from a ceiling drip? Neither option is comforting, but at least you'll know what to expect. And in this place, a little predictability is as close to peace as you're going to get. The noise starts around midnight. Not a bang or a scream. Nothing so dramatic. Just a slow, rhythmic grumble. Then a snort. Then a sort of wheezing gasp that escalates into a full-throated rumble like a bear chewing through gravel. You bolt awake in your bunk, eyes wide, heart hammering, convinced the roof is collapsing or a moose has wandered in looking for beans. But no, it's not an animal, it's snoring. You lie there, staring at the bunk above, blinking into the darkness. The snoring rolls through the bunkhouse in waves. One man starts, another joins, then a third finds the same key and harmony, and suddenly the entire structure is vibrating with the sleep sounds of 22 exhausted lumberjacks. It's a symphony of suffering. Deep bass growls, high-pitched nasal whistles, chesty coughs that double as percussion. Somewhere, impossibly, someone is humming through their nose like a small warbler trapped in wool. There's no escaping it. You shove your blanket against your ears, jam your cap down low, and try to find a mental safe place. A forest clearing, a quiet lake, anything. But every time you drift near sleep, another snort jerks you back. A man somewhere near the stove lets out a long guttural snore, followed by an abrupt silence. You wait, breath held. Then, with comic timing, a deafening inhale. It's like he's swallowing the room. Historically, this was standard fare. Lumberjack bunkhouses were known for their extreme noise levels at night. Most loggers worked as 12 to 14-hour days, came in battered and barely conscious, and crashed into bed with the grace of dropped firewood. The snoring wasn't just common, it was legendary. In one journal from a Michigan camp, a greenhorn wrote, "The walls did quake, the windows did tremble, and I thought myself among demons." You'd laugh if it weren't so relatable. It's not just snoring. There's talking too. Sleep talking. Full conversations held in garbled nonsense. One guy mumbles about sled dogs. Another mutters a string of what might be Irish curses. Someone in the top bunk near the chimney sits bolt upright and says, "They took the beans," before collapsing again. Nobody wakes up. Nobody remembers. You, meanwhile, lie awake, slowly questioning your life choices and sanity. And here's the weirdest fringe fact of all. Some bunkhouses designated a snore corner, a literal section of the room where the loudest sleepers were assigned bunks so their combined nasal orchestra could be somewhat contained. It didn't work. It just meant one side of the cabin sounded like a steam engine repair shop, and the other side seethed with envy and sleep deprivation. At one point, someone tosses in their sleep and lets out what can only be described as a yodel snore. A snodel? You lose track of time trying to categorize the various types. The log saw, the backfire, the boiler pop. It's absurd, but your brain is tired enough to commit to the bit. Somewhere between annoyance and resignation, you almost start to find it funny. Almost. But then come the snore fights. They begin when one man, probably driven to the brink, throws something across the room. A boot hits the wall. The snoring pauses. Silence reigns for 3 miraculous seconds. And then, from the far left corner, a return volley. A wad of socks thwacks someone in the face. You hear a muffled curse. Then a shout, "For God's sake, shut your damn mouth, Chuck!" Chuck, presumably, is the source of the worst of it. Or maybe just the unlucky one whose snores peaked at the wrong moment. What follows is a flurry of half-asleep insults. A few choice words about someone's mother, and a threat involving stuffing snow down someone's long johns. A boot is retrieved and thrown again. One man sits up and mutters, "Let the man breathe, he's dying." Another retorts, "He's not dying, he's broadcasting weather warnings." It's all hilarious in the light of day, but right now it feels like your brain is melting. The debate among historians here is genuinely entertaining. Some say the bunkhouse conditions created such extreme exhaustion that most men simply passed out regardless of the noise. Others insist that sleep disruptions were a serious morale issue, and fights, sometimes physical, did break out over snoring, talking, and blanket hogging. There are even records of one camp that rotated bunk assignments weekly to prevent long-term grudges from festering. It didn't help. Eventually, the noise settles. Not because anyone stopped snoring, but because your body gives up. You reach a level of exhaustion so profound that you transcend discomfort. You float in a space between consciousness and unconsciousness, where the rhythmic rumble of the snorers becomes white noise. It's like sleeping inside a very angry beehive. But it's sleep. You'll take it. Until, plop. A drip from the frosted rafter lands directly in your left ear. You jolt upright, sputtering. The snoring continues, unbothered, eternal. You wipe the icy water from your face and consider just walking out into the snow and sleeping among the logs. Maybe the forest is quieter. Maybe the bears are gentler. You don't, of course. You roll over. You shove the corner of your blanket into your ear. You accept your fate. This is what sleep looks like in a lumber camp. Loud, chaotic, damp, and entirely out of your control. The bunkhouse might keep the cold out, but it offers no protection from the noise within. As dawn begins to scratch at the seams of the bunkhouse walls, the snoring begins to ebb. Men stir, grumble, stretch. The wood stove gets a fresh log, and the symphony fades into the usual groggy shuffle of morning survival. You drag yourself up, eyes bleary, ears still ringing. Another night conquered, barely. You step outside into the frozen air, take one breath of clean silence, and try to remember what quiet felt like. It's already slipping away. There's no tactful way to say this, so let's just get it over with. The bunkhouse smells like a wet animal that gave up on hygiene halfway through hibernation. If you had to describe it with more precision, and unfortunately, you do, you'd say it's a mixture of sour wool, foot rot, stale tobacco, singed beard hair, and the slow, creeping funk of humanity in close quarters with very few bathing options. It's not even one smell. It's layers. Complex, evolving. Like a wine that makes your eyes water and your nose regret existing. You wake up with it in your nostrils, in your mouth, on your clothes. It's inescapable. It's permanent. It's in the wood, in the blankets, in the very grain of the floorboards. You didn't notice it much at first. Your nose went numb pretty early on, but now that you've settled into this way of life, your senses have returned. And they are not impressed. The center of the bunkhouse is the worst. That's where the stove is, and where everyone congregates after the day's work. So it's also where the sweat drips, where the boots dry, where the wet mittens steam and sizzle, and release the sort of odor that makes livestock wince. Someone tossed their socks too close to the fire last night, and this morning the air is thick with the greasy perfume of wool that's been baked to the edge of combustion. It's hard to say whether it's worse than the smell of cold, but it's definitely more aggressive. Here's your historical fact for today. Many bunkhouses never had windows, or if they did, they were small slits high on the wall, often nailed shut during winter to keep out drafts. That meant no ventilation. All the smoke, steam, and body odor just swirled around like a trapped ghost with digestive issues. The result? An air quality that could best be described as chewy. Men got used to it. Or more accurately, they stopped complaining because there was no point. After a while, you don't smell it anymore. But heaven help the outsider who walks in. There are stories of visitors retching at the threshold. You pull on your pants, still damp from yesterday, and step into the mess. The floor is coated in the debris of desperate men. Bark scraps, sawdust, bits of string, someone's long-lost mittens, and what might be an old piece of biscuit. A man near the door is attempting to air out his boots by stuffing them with pine needles. Another has his shirt open to the stove, steam rising from his chest like a volcano in a flannel valley. There is a definite funk coming off him. You turn away before your coffee rebels. And here's the quirky part. Some lumberjacks swore by carrying around bits of spruce gum, not just to chew on, but to mask the smell of their own breath. Others tucked herbs or mint leaves into their scarves or under their hats, claiming it kept the stink away, or at least confused it long enough to get through the day. One legendary old-timer supposedly wore a dried orange peel in a pouch around his neck, like a natural air freshener. That orange was passed down to his nephew. You don't know if that's inspiring or revolting. Today's work is hard, like every other day. And when you return, exhausted and dripping with snowmelt, the bunkhouse air greets you like a warm, moist wall. You breathe through your mouth, but that just adds taste to the experience. So you accept it. You step into the mire of men and try not to think about where that puddle came from. Around the stove, laundry hangs on every surface. Socks over the rafters. Shirts dangling from nails in the wall. Someone has laid their trousers directly over the stovepipe, which is both bold and potentially explosive. The mix of drying fabrics and body steam creates a cloud of damp warmth that fogs your vision. You're fairly certain you saw a fungus growing on someone's undershirt. No one's brave enough to move it. And now comes the open scholarly debate. Did men in these camps develop immunity to their own filth, or did they just ignore it out of sheer exhaustion? Some historians argue that the immune systems of lumberjacks were in a constant state of alert, bombarded by bacteria and sweat and smoke in ways that would flatten a modern office worker. Others suggest it was psychological. When your body is breaking from physical labor, you simply don't have room left in your mind to worry about smell. You settle into your bunk after another long day, and as you pull the blanket up, you catch a whiff of yourself. It's impressive. Somewhere between moldy bread and wood smoke-scented despair, you vow, again, to wash tomorrow. With what, though? The river is frozen. The camp's water barrels are icy crusts. The one tin bucket of warm water available is currently being fought over by 3 guys who all claim to have lice. You decide to embrace the stink for one more night. Lying there in the dark, you listen to the soft creaking of the bunkhouse and the occasional squelch of someone wringing out a sock. A man near the far wall is trying to light a cigar with a sliver of bark. Another is plucking something from his foot and examining it like a rare gemstone. You close your eyes and breathe shallowly. The truth is, as much as the bunkhouse smells like a locker room built inside a compost heap, it's part of the deal. You smell like everyone else. and they smell like you. There's no shame here. No one's judging. You're all too tired for that. Too focused on surviving the cold, the work, the next meal. Smelling like a dead bear is just part of the uniform. Still, just before you fall asleep, you catch a breeze of fresh air from the slightly cracked door. It's freezing. It's sharp. But it smells like pine trees and sky and silence. And for a moment, just a brief, flickering second, it reminds you what clean used to feel like. You inhale, slowly, deeply. Then someone farts, and the moment's gone. If you thought the bunkhouse was chaotic during the night, wait until you see it during mealtime. You think you've lived through hunger. You think you've been in a rush. But nothing prepares you for the daily stampede to the cook shack, a ritual that lies somewhere between a religious pilgrimage and a full contact sport. There's no bell or horn, just the sudden, instinctive movement of 20+ men all at once, rising like startled cattle at the scent of boiling meat. You follow the crowd through the snow, boots thudding across the frozen path that winds between the bunkhouse and the cook shack. The wind slices through your layers as you trudge, stomach growling. This is the only time the bunkhouse empties itself in under a minute. Hunger has a gravitational pull, and everyone is caught in its orbit. The cook shack is barely a building. 4 log walls, a sagging roof, and a door that hangs on optimism. But it's warm, it's noisy, and it smells like heaven filtered through pork grease. The second you open the door, steam rushes out, carrying with it the scent of something vaguely edible. You're not picky anymore. If it's hot and solid, you'll eat it. If it's not solid, you'll still eat it. If it moves, you'll stare it down and eat it anyway. Inside, the men are already jostling for places at the long plank tables. There's no assigned seating, no formality, just pure, hungry chaos. You squeeze in between 2 men who smell like burnt gloves and tree sap and grab a dented tin plate. The cook, a barrel-chested man with forearms like smoked hams, slops food onto it without looking. Today, it's beans, again. Brown, lumpy, semi-liquid beans with occasional guess. Bits of pork or maybe tree bark. Hard to tell. Here's your historical fact. Logging camp cooks, also called cookies, were the unsung royalty of the woods. A good cookie could make or break a camp. They cooked 3 meals a day for dozens of ravenous men, often starting at 4 a.m. and finishing after dark. Their kitchens were crude, wood stoves, iron pots, battered ladles, and yet they turned out stews, biscuits, flapjacks, boiled meats, sometimes even pies. Cookies were allowed to be rude, eccentric, or flat-out terrifying, because the men knew one truth: never offend the guy who feeds you. You shovel the beans into your mouth with mechanical speed. The bread is hard enough to chip a molar. The tea is dark, hot, and faintly metallic. Someone starts passing a jug of molasses down the line, and you pour a generous blob onto your plate, not to sweeten anything, but to confuse your taste buds into submission. Around you, the conversation is minimal, just chewing, slurping, and the occasional belch of approval. A few guys joke about the mystery meat that showed up in yesterday's stew. The theories range from squirrel to boot leather to whatever was crawling on Eli's bunk. No one really wants an answer. And now for a fringe fact you probably weren't ready for. Some cook shacks kept a pot simmering all day, every day, known simply as the stew. Into it went scraps of everything: meat, beans, onions, leftover biscuits, the occasional egg, and yes, once or twice, a rat that had the misfortune of dying near the fire. It was like a living soup, constantly evolving. The longer it cooked, the more flavor it accumulated. Some men swore by it. Others swore at it. As the meal winds down, the cook slams a pan onto the table and bellows, "Last call!" like a bartender at the end of the world. A few men scurry up for seconds. Others just slump in their seats, full and drowsy. One guy wipes his mouth on his sleeve, leans back, and sighs like he just came back from a tropical vacation. You suspect he hasn't had functioning taste buds since October. The scholarly debate around meals in lumber camps is oddly passionate. Some historians argue the food was hearty and sustaining, high in calories, made with love, or at least butter, and served hot. Others claim the monotony was brutal, the ingredients often spoiled, and that malnutrition wasn't uncommon, especially late in the season when supplies dwindled. Diaries from the time back up both views. Some men remembered their cookies fondly. Others noted that the beans were mostly rock hard and the bread was only useful if you'd run out of firewood. Back in the bunkhouse, post-meal drowsiness settles over the men like a blanket. Some light pipes and sit by the stove, swapping exaggerated tales about logging injuries or close calls with moose. A few start card games, dealing dog-eared decks onto crates or boots. Others just lie on their bunks, staring at the ceiling frost, digesting slowly. You climb into your own bunk and let out a grunt of satisfaction. The food wasn't gourmet, but it was filling. And in this world, that's enough. Your hands still smell like beans. Your breath could light a lantern. But your belly's warm, and that means your mood is almost cheerful. Until the guy next to you farts with the force of a backfiring steam engine. Nobody says anything. Nobody reacts. This is just life now. You roll over and exhale deeply, trying to replace the smell with whatever faint trace of molasses still clings to your upper lip. It doesn't work. Still, you can't help but chuckle. Quietly. To yourself. Because in a place where warmth, food, and sleep are your three most valuable resources, a plate of mystery beans and some scorched bread is the closest thing to luxury you're going to find. And despite the stink, the chaos, and the fire hazard hanging from the rafters, you'll take it. You always do. You're not the only thing living in the bunkhouse. You discover this on a moonless night when you roll over and feel something scurry across your foot. Your first thought is that someone's toe has gone rogue. Your second, more accurate thought comes a moment later when you hear the tiny, unmistakable sound of claws on wood and a soft rustle near the edge of your blanket. You freeze. You wait. Then comes the faintest squeak, and suddenly you're wide awake, heart pounding, eyes darting around the dark like a nervous raccoon yourself. You lie still for a long time, blanket pulled up to your chin, listening. The room is its usual symphony of snoring, wheezing, and the occasional dream mutter, but now layered with something else. The whispery footsteps of something small and curious exploring your bunk like it's a hotel suite. You flick your fingers at the edge of the bed and hear it scurry off. Hopefully. By morning, it's clear you weren't hallucinating. The bag of flour someone stashed near the stove has been chewed through, leaving a delicate snowdrift of powder across the floor. There's a neat trail of little footprints leading away and under the far wall. A hunk of bread left on a bunk has vanished entirely. A man named Chester claims he saw two eyes glowing from the woodpile. Everyone laughs. Chester does not. Here's the historical fact of the day. Nearly every lumber camp bunkhouse had a rodent problem. Mice, rats, even squirrels or chipmunks found the warm interior and constant food scraps irresistible. They built nests in the walls, under bunks, even inside boots if they were left untouched long enough. Some men tried to keep them at bay with traps. Others simply coexisted, treating the mice like unwanted but familiar roommates. You're not thrilled by the idea, but it's not like you're in a position to demand pest control. You don't have any cheese, but you do have a half-eaten biscuit, which you reluctantly sacrifice to lure the visitor out from under your bunk. That night, You lie in wait like a sleepy predator, hoping to catch a glimpse. Sure enough, around midnight, a tiny nose pokes out from a crack in the floorboard, followed by a sleek little gray body. You stare. It stares. Then it makes a noise that might be a sneeze and disappears again. A few days later, someone declares war. That someone is Big Nolan, who wakes up to find his long johns chewed through in a place no man should ever find holes. He bellows, throws his boots against the wall, and then begins a campaign to eradicate every rat, mouse, and whiskered hellspawn in the building. He builds traps from bent nails, bits of spring, and terrifying ingenuity. He lines up tin cans like an arsenal. He sleeps with a hatchet under his pillow. You try not to get involved, but you notice your gloves have been nibbled. So maybe Nolan has a point. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some men, in a moment of winter madness or extreme loneliness, actually befriended the mice, fed them bits of bread, named them, let them curl up in coat pockets at night. One man supposedly trained his bunkhouse mouse to run a full lap along the rafters in exchange for a bit of dried apple. When the camp cat eventually got it, he held a funeral. With singing. You're not there yet, but ask again in February. Of course, rodents aren't the only nighttime visitors. There's the raccoon. No one knows exactly how it got in. Probably through the firewood hatch or a crack in the roof. But one night, right around bedtime, there's a clatter near the cook's gear and a flurry of curses. Men jump up from their bunks, and someone grabs a shovel. In the flickering light of the stove, you see it. A fat, shaggy raccoon perched atop a sack of oats, staring at everyone like it owns the place. It snorts, hops down, and vanishes into the shadows before anyone can reach it. From then on, it becomes the stuff of legend. Some say it's the ghost of a former logger. Others swear it steals things, spoons, buttons, pipe tobacco, and leaves pine cones in their place. Someone claims it winked at him. You begin to suspect the raccoon is smarter than half the men in the bunkhouse. Attempts to trap it fail. One night, a man sets out a fishbone tied to a snare. By morning, the fish is gone. The snare is neatly coiled, and a piece of folded paper with the word "nice try" has been left in its place. The handwriting is suspiciously neat. You're not sure who the raccoon's accomplice is, but you suspect Eli. And here's the open debate. Was wildlife intrusion in lumber camps a sign of poor hygiene, or simply unavoidable in such remote conditions? Some argue it was a consequence of sloppy food handling, men tossing scraps near the stove, storing biscuits under their bunks, wiping grease on their sleeves. Others suggest that when you build a wooden box in the middle of the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and cold, everything wants in. Either way, the animals were a fact of life. By now, you've learned to shake out your boots every morning, to sleep with your bread tied in a sack and tucked under your pillow, to listen for the soft click of claws on wood and the occasional scuffling in the rafters. You've accepted that the bunkhouse isn't just home to lumberjacks, it's a forest ecosystem under a leaky roof. You lie in bed that night, tucked into your blanket, eyes scanning the dark. A faint squeak from the far corner, a rustle near the woodpile, then silence. Then somehow, even more unsettling, a tiny, high-pitched belch. You close your eyes and pull the blanket over your head. You'll deal with it in the morning. It starts with the socks. It always does. You'd think something as innocent as a pair of wool socks wouldn't wield such power. But here, in the confines of a frost-bitten wooden box shared with a couple dozen other men, socks might as well be nuclear weapons. Specifically, wet socks, steaming, sagging, pungent wool bombs hanging above the stove like the world's saddest holiday decorations. Tonight, the stove is surrounded by boots, mittens, shirts, and, of course, an aggressive number of socks draped across every available surface. Rafters, chairbacks, pot hooks. Someone's rigged a drying line using twine, and two dulled axes jammed into the wall. On it dangle an entire week's worth of sweat-stiff socks, flapping gently in the radiant heat like flags of surrender. You join the circle, peeling off your own damp layers, each one releasing a ghost of steam and something like regret. Your socks squish when you pull them off. You hang them on a spare nail hammered into the stovepipe platform. Instantly, the heat causes them to curl in on themselves like dying insects. The stink, immediate, potent. Someone gags. Someone else yells, "Whose socks are those? What died in them?" You look away. Here's your historical fact. Drying clothes was one of the biggest logistical headaches in a winter lumber camp. With no running water, no laundry services, and limited firewood, men had to rotate their gear constantly, trying to get something dry enough to wear while still keeping the stove hot and the bunkhouse breathable. Socks were especially problematic. Wet socks meant frostbite. Frostbite meant lost toes. So everyone dried them, whether the air liked it or not. But there's no science here, only chaos. You're essentially baking wool in a giant human oven. Some socks hang too close to the fire and start to sizzle. Others drip melted snow onto the stovetop, sending up clouds of steam so thick they fog the windows. One sock actually ignites. A cheer goes up. Someone beats it out with a mitten, then hangs it right back up, slightly blackened, but no worse for wear. You've seen grown men turn on each other over sock placement. Earlier this evening, two guys nearly came to blows because one man's sock kept dripping foulness onto another's stew. The cook has since banned food from the stove zone, which has done nothing but move the argument to who gets to dry first. You start to see why people choose to live alone in the woods. And now, the fringe fact. In one camp legend, a logger allegedly created a rotating sock wheel, a crude wooden frame mounted near the fire, with pegs for socks that could be turned like a spit over the heat. His bunkmates dubbed it the sock Ferris, and it was a brief marvel until it tipped over and sent 4 pairs of half-cooked wool flying into the fire. They ate bean stew with a faint, smoky sock undertone that night. No one spoke of it again. Back in the bunkhouse, someone has started singing. It's a soft, aimless hum that turns into a folksy tune about whiskey and winter and losing your boots in a river. It mingles with the bubbling of wet gloves on the stovepipe and the occasional psht of water hitting hot iron. You're seated on a crate near the back, cradling your feet in your hands, watching your socks deflate with every passing minute. The scholarly debate on this isn't about socks, specifically, but about how much time was spent indoors during winter storms. Some researchers argue that downtime in the bunkhouse allowed men to rest, mend their gear, and prepare for the next wave of brutal labor. Others suggest the idle time drove everyone slowly insane. Based on the current state of affairs, 3 men arguing over whether the smell is cheesy or earthy, one guy trying to iron his shirt with a hot frying pan, and a 4th carving a spoon from a single bootlace. You're leaning toward the insanity theory. Suddenly, the bunkhouse door creaks open. A blast of cold air floods the room. Everyone groans in unison like a choir of dying cows. A figure stomps in, shaking snow off his coat, cheeks bright red from the cold. He smells fresh. You hate him instantly. He pauses, surveys the room, and mutters, "Smells like war crime in here." Someone throws a glove at him. Laughter erupts. The sock crisis is temporarily forgotten. You shift your feet closer to the stove. Your toes are tingling. The painful kind of tingling that either means they're waking up or they're quitting. You don't want to find out which. The socks are almost dry. Almost. But not quite. And if you put them on too early, they'll just trap the damp, which is worse than wearing nothing. So you wait, and you hope. The problem is that everyone's in the same boat. Every guy here has 2, 3, sometimes 4 pairs of socks in various states of filth and dampness. And with only one stove, space is limited. So men start layering, sock on sock on sock. The result is a tangle of wool so confusing you forget which ones are yours. You pull one down, sniff it, recoil, then try again. Eventually, you settle for a pair that doesn't belong to you, but smells the least like cheese. Ownership is a flexible concept here. Night falls. The fire burns low. The last pair of socks hits the floor with a wet slap. The bunkhouse is warm, thick with the scent of drying wool and scorched pine sap. You lie in your bunk, socks tucked under your blanket, using your own body heat to finish the job. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, it's strangely quiet. Until someone, somewhere in the dark, says, "I think my sock just moved." Nobody answers. Nobody wants to know. You close your eyes and breathe through your mouth. Just another night in paradise. You'd think the most dangerous part of living in a bunkhouse would be the cold, or maybe the wild animals, or the small chance of being buried alive by snow in your sleep. And yes, all of that is terrifying. But let's not forget the real threat. The one that creeps in when you're tired, distracted, and swinging a dangerously sharp tool around 20 other equally distracted, equally tired men. The axe. You've never had this much respect for a piece of metal before, not until you watched someone bury one into a log, only to have the wood split unevenly and send a sliver flying across the yard fast enough to embed itself in another guy's leg. Just a little. Just enough for him to shout something creative and fall over like a cut tree himself. Everyone rushed in, of course, but slowly, because even in crisis, no one wants to move too fast on snow-covered ice with blades in their hands. Today, the talk in the bunkhouse is all about that accident. It happened just before lunch, and everyone saw it. Big Nolan, yes, him again, was felling a pine when his axe glanced off a hidden knot, kicked back, and kissed his shin like it meant it. Blood? Oh yeah. Gushed right through his pants, pooling in the snow like someone spilled cranberry sauce at a picnic no one wanted to attend. Here's your historical fact. Injuries were so common in lumber camps that some men didn't even bother reporting them unless something broke, detached, or required a tourniquet. Stitches were improvised with needle and thread, and antiseptics were whatever you could boil, burn, or pour straight from a flask. There were no doctors on site, no clinics in the woods. You got patched up by the cook or the bull cook, or sometimes just another guy with steady hands and a grim expression. In Nolan's case, the bleeding slowed after they packed the wound with snow and wrapped it in a shirt sleeve. He limped into the bunkhouse like a wounded bear and collapsed on the floor, laughing as someone offered him a sock as a bandage. He declined. The room was too warm for good decisions, but even Nolan has limits. And that brings us to the first aid kit, or rather, the box of pain, as it's known. It's a dented tin with exactly 5 items: a bottle of cheap whiskey, 2 rolls of linen bandage, already stained, a sewing needle stuck into a cork, a wooden splint, and a mystery salve in a tin labeled hoof balm. No one knows what's in it, but it smells like pine tar and regret. Someone claims it's bear grease mixed with ashes. Another guy says it's beaver oil. You decide not to ask. Here's your fringe fact for the day. Some lumberjacks believe that chewing tobacco could disinfect wounds. Yes, really. You'd take a wad of chaw, spit on the injury, and call it medicine. Was it effective? Absolutely not. Did it stop people from trying? Also, number. One man in your bunkhouse swears his granddad fought off gangrene with nothing but whiskey and Copenhagen. He now has 3 toes, but the confidence of 10. That night, the air in the bunkhouse buzzes with the memory of the accident. Everyone tells their own version. The log was cursed. The axe was dull. Nolan sneezed. There are even whispers that the forest itself lashes out sometimes, like it resents being chopped. You smirk. But then you remember the way the wind screamed through the trees earlier, like something ancient and angry waking up. The scholarly debate here is simple. Was lumber camp injury prevention completely non-existent or just badly implemented? Some historians argue there were informal systems, training from older loggers, assigned spotters, even early safety rules about how to fell trees and handle equipment. Others paint a bleaker picture. No rules, no oversight, just a bunch of overworked men doing their best not to die. Based on what you've seen, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, buried under a pile of splinters and snow. You glance down at your hands, blistered, raw, one fingernail turning a suspicious color. You've been careful, but careful doesn't guarantee anything out here. The axes are sharp, the terrain is slick, and most of the time you're too cold to even notice pain until it's screaming at you through your wool layers. After dinner, which is stew again, this time with a bone in it that may or may not belong to a rabbit, someone starts showing off their scars. It's a contest now. Eli pulls down his sock to reveal a jagged white mark along his ankle. "Fell through the ice," he says, proudly. The cook lifts his sleeve to show a burn shaped like a ladle. "Hot oil, 1897. Another guy casually rolls up his pants to display a gnarled knot of tissue on his calf. No story, just a look that says, "Don't ask." You laugh because what else can you do? You're a walking bruise, a collection of sore spots and developing limps. Everyone is. You feel like a pile of bones wearing wet flannel and bravado. But that's the job. That's bunkhouse life. The pain is part of the furniture. Before bed, you check your axe. Wipe it down. Inspect the edge. Place it carefully under your bunk. Handle out, blade in. A small ritual, but one that makes you feel slightly more in control. You lie down, staring at the ceiling frost, and listen as Nolan snores softly from his bunk, leg propped up, bandage still faintly red. He'll be fine. Probably. You will too. Probably. Sleep takes its time tonight, but when it finally comes, it wraps around you like gauze. You dream of trees that bleed and axes that sing. You wake once in the night to adjust your foot, which cramped during a dream about outrunning a runaway sled. You laugh into your pillow, because somehow you're still here. Bruised, cut, exhausted, but still here. By now you've accepted the fact that personal hygiene is more concept than reality. You wake up smelling like smoke and stew and sleep. You're not sure if your shirt still has a collar or if it's simply unraveled out of shame. Your socks haven't seen true dryness in over a week, and you strongly suspect the undershirt you're wearing is gaining sentience. Still, you tell yourself today is the day. Today, by some miracle, you're going to bathe. Step 1. Motivation. You build it up for hours. Through breakfast, through the morning's chores, through the deeply philosophical conversation about whether rats can develop personalities. Everyone's got theories. One man swears he saw a mouse dragging a spoon. You listen, nod, and think about warm water. You haven't felt truly clean since autumn. Step 2. Securing a bucket. There are 3, technically, in camp. One's full of coal chunks. One has a leak that nobody's fixed because it's considered character building. The third, your prize, is currently being used to soak a pair of trousers that fell into some sort of cooking accident. The cook won't elaborate. You wait. You pace. Eventually, the pants are fished out with tongs, and the bucket is yours. Step 3. acquiring water. This involves a short, freezing walk to the stream, or more accurately, the giant white slab where a stream used to be. You chip away at the ice with an axe, your breath fogging the air like dragon smoke. After 20 minutes, you have water. Sort of. It's slush with a side of pine needles and one brave mosquito encased in ice like a prehistoric fossil. You shrug. Extra protein. Back in the bunkhouse, you set the bucket near the stove and wait. And wait. And wait some more. Everyone's drying their socks again. Someone's laid their entire coat across the stovetop, like it's a roast. The fire burns low, sluggish, exhausted from days of endless demands, but eventually, finally, the water steams. Not boils, just steams enough that you believe it might not kill you on contact. Here's your historical fact. Most lumberjacks didn't bathe often during winter, not because they didn't want to, but because it was borderline suicidal to undress in freezing temperatures. Camps without bathhouses, i.e., most of them, relied on bucket baths near the stove, heated river water, or the occasional snow rubdown. Yes, snow, as a cleansing tool. The early version of a spa exfoliation, but with frostbite. You stake your claim by the stove. The ritual begins, shirt off first, slow, sticky, the wool clinging to you like it knows what's coming. Then the undershirt. Then everything else, down to your last frigid thread of decency. You brace yourself, grab the rag, dip it in the bucket, and slap it across your chest. You immediately regret everything you've ever done. The shock is pure, icy, electrifying. Your lungs refuse to cooperate. Your skin erupts into goosebumps so intense you briefly consider if this is what porcupines feel like. But the worst part, it's not even that cold. You've just forgotten what not cold feels like. You scrub anyway. You have to. Armpits, neck, face, back of the knees. The water hits you like tiny insults. The rag is rough. The steam rising from your own skin feels like shame made visible. Around you, men look on with horror and awe, like you're performing a complicated surgery on yourself with nothing but twine and hubris. Someone claps slowly. Someone else offers a sarcastic prayer. You glare at both and continue. Here's your fringe fact. A few camps built crude saunas, especially ones with Scandinavian crews. They'd stack rocks, pour water over them, and bask in the steam before running out into the snow like joyful maniacs. It sounds absurd. It also sounds kind of amazing. Your camp has no such luxury. Just a bucket, a fire, and a strong will to smell slightly less like a salted goat. Once you're done, you towel off with what's technically a blanket someone cut in half last year. It scratches. It doesn't absorb. It barely qualifies as fabric, but it does the job. Sort of. Your skin feels red and raw, but also strangely invigorated, like you've shed a layer of failure. Then comes the worst part, redressing. Because all your clothes are still cold, you pull on each item like it's being punished. Damp socks, stiff shirt, trousers that now smell more like steam than filth. And yet, you feel reborn. Slightly, marginally. You catch a whiff of your own shoulder and raise your eyebrows. Not bad, you think, in the way a man stranded on an island might find seaweed not bad. The scholarly debate surrounding hygiene in lumber camps is mostly centered on how much it actually mattered. Some argue that poor hygiene contributed to sickness, skin conditions, and low morale. Others believe the cold itself killed off most bacteria, and that as long as wounds were treated quickly, the stink didn't much matter. Most agree, however, that morale improved drastically after a bath, no matter how brief or ineffective it technically was. You sit by the stove for a while, basking in the afterglow of being slightly less disgusting. Your hair is still damp. Your teeth feel cleaner. even though you haven't touched a brush in weeks. A man next to you sniffs the air, then sniffs again, squinting. Did somebody bathe? You nod slowly, proudly. He shakes his head like he's seen a ghost. You'll throw off the balance in here. You both laugh. Then he scoots away, muttering about not wanting to be infected with ambition. You retreat to your bunk, warmed by the fire, tired from the scrubbing, skin still tingling from the icy rag. You smell less like survival and more like something approaching human. And even if it only lasts a day, 2 if you're lucky, it's enough to make you feel like you still belong to the world outside these woods. You lie back and sigh. You've earned this. Then, from somewhere across the bunkhouse, someone calls out, "Who used my bucket?" You pretend to be asleep. By nightfall, the bunkhouse takes on a strange new energy. It's not quiet, not exactly, but it shifts. The hum of sawing and hammering fades. The coughs get deeper. The stove crackles louder. Men slump into their bunks and into themselves. You'd think with all the fatigue, with how hard everyone works from sunup to sundown, they'd just pass out after dinner. But that's not how it goes. Not in here. Not after a long day in the woods, because after supper and after the nightly sock rotation around the stove, there's still something left in the air. Restlessness. It starts with a flick of cards. Not the kind you'd find in a casino. These are battered, bent, half-faded scraps of pasteboard so old they probably remember when Lincoln was president. Someone pulls them from a tin and slaps them on a crate, and like moths to a flame, the bunkhouse stirs. A few men shuffle over, drag benches across the floor. One guy sits on an overturned bucket. Another perches on his own boots. No one says much. They just nod and deal. You hang back at first, watching. Poker? Maybe. Euchre? Possibly. It's hard to tell because the rules shift depending on who's dealing, who's winning, and how close you are to payday. Gambling in camp is unofficially forbidden, but also entirely unavoidable. The stakes aren't always money. Sometimes it's tobacco. Sometimes socks. One time, you saw a man lose his bunk for a week. He slept curled up in the cook shack next to a bag of onions and said it was the best rest he'd had in months. Here's your historical fact. Gambling was rampant in lumber camps, especially during the long, frozen winters when boredom became its own kind of torment. Card games were the most common, but dice and coin flips made regular appearances too. Some camps tried to ban games entirely, but most gave up. It was better to let the men blow off steam with a little harmless wagering than let that frustration turn into something worse. And something worse always hovered nearby. It doesn't take long. One man swears the deck is marked. Another claims someone's been accidentally palming cards. Voices raise. A fist slams the table. Suddenly someone's chair goes flying, and just like that, the game ends in the time-honored fashion, with a fist fight. Fights in the bunkhouse are a strange thing. There's no warning, no build-up, just a snap of tension, and then it's on. 2 tired men, shirt collars gripped, boots scuffing on the warped wooden floor, throwing half-hearted punches more out of obligation than rage. Nobody tries to stop it right away. Fights are almost ritual, a release valve. Most end before blood's drawn. Most don't even leave bruises. But every so often, someone lands a real shot, and then it turns serious. This time, it fizzles. A little shoving, a lot of swearing, and finally someone throws a wet sock at both of them and tells them to go settle it in the snow like civilized men. That gets a few laughs. The cards are gathered. The crate is kicked over. The night shifts again. Now comes the quieter unrest. One guy starts whittling, his knife scraping softly at a block of cedar. He's making a spoon, maybe, or a duck. It's hard to tell, and he's not the type to explain. Another man pulls out a harmonica and plays a tune that wanders between cheerful and miserable. Someone sings a few lines before trailing off. It's not that he doesn't remember the words. It's just that no one here is used to hearing their own voice out loud. Here's your fringe fact. Fistfights weren't just tolerated, they were often expected. Camps were full of men from different backgrounds, languages, temperaments, and pasts. Tensions were inevitable. Fighting was how you proved your spine, aired your grievances, and earned your place. It was rarely about winning. It was about participating. Men respected each other more after a scuffle. Sometimes even became bunkmates. Nothing says bonding like a shared bloody nose. You've managed to avoid a fight so far. Probably because you've kept your mouth shut and your cards close. But you've seen the glances, the sizing up, the way a joke can tip into something sharper with just one wrong word. In this place, where privacy doesn't exist and tempers run hot while the air runs cold, the edge between friendship and fury is paper thin. The scholarly question is this: were bunkhouse brawls a symptom of cabin fever, or an organic form of social regulation? Some historians lean toward the idea that these fights kept the peace in the long run. Better to throw a punch now and be done with it than let things fester. Others suggest it reflected deeper issues: class tension, loneliness, trauma carried in from lives before the woods. Either way, the fists flew, and the bunkhouse absorbed it like another log on the fire. Tonight, things cool down quickly. The men who almost fought are already laughing about it, tossing barbed jokes instead of punches. You hear someone mutter, "He hits like a tired goat," and the other just grins. By midnight, the card games are done, the harmonica's silent, and most of the room has sunk into that half-drowsy murmur of bedtime. Someone writes a letter home with hands like claws. Someone else is reading, yes, reading, a tattered penny novel by the firelight, lips moving slightly with every word. You lie back in your bunk, hands behind your head, the noise fading around you. There's something comforting about the bunkhouse now, despite the earlier tension. It's like the building itself has seen so many fights and forgiven so many insults that it doesn't even bother reacting anymore. It just creaks and groans and carries on, like the rest of you. Outside, the wind picks up. The trees groan. Inside, someone coughs in their sleep. And you? You drift off, dreaming of card games you didn't play and fights you narrowly avoided. Because out here, survival's not just about warmth and food. It's about knowing when to swing and when to fold. You never thought snow could be loud, not until it fell for 48 hours straight, blanketing the forest like a grudge and muffling every sound until even your thoughts echoed. And then, just when you thought the world might stay buried in silence forever, came the crack. A sharp, tree-splitting pop somewhere in the woods, followed by a low rumble that sounded too much like a warning. By the time the snow finally stops, the bunkhouse is practically sealed inside a world of white. The door sticks when you try to open it. Not from ice this time. No, this is weight. Raw, suffocating snow stacked up against the frame like nature's own blockade. You grunt, push harder, and eventually manage to wedge it open just enough to squeeze out. The cold hits like a slap. You squint into the frozen haze, and for a second, you can't even see the tree line. Everything's buried. The woodpile's vanished. The latrine, gone. Just a smooth, unbroken expanse of snow rising like dunes across the camp. Looks like we're not going anywhere, someone says from behind you. And they're right. Welcome to the lock-in. Here's your historical fact. Winter storms this heavy were more than just inconvenient. They could isolate logging camps for days, even weeks. Roads were impassable. Supply sleds couldn't make it through. And if a camp wasn't prepared with enough firewood, food, or patience, things could get ugly fast. Some men saw it as a chance to rest. Others saw it as a slow, spiraling descent into madness. Back inside, the mood starts to shift. At first, it's almost celebratory. No work, fine by everyone. Axes stay in the corner, boots stay dry. The stove roars a little louder, fed by the last of the inside woodpile. There's extra coffee. Someone even finds a dusty tin of molasses and cracks it open like treasure. It tastes like old nails and sugar, but it's something. The bunks are fuller now. Men stretched out, talking, whittling, doing anything to not be outside. Stories flow faster. Laughter comes easier. For a while, it feels almost cozy. And then, the storm day becomes a storm night. Then, a storm second day. And that's when the edges start to fray. Here's your fringe fact. There's at least one recorded instance of a snowed-in logging crew in Ontario turning to musical theater to preserve their sanity. No joke. They wrote songs, acted out scenes, and staged a performance called The Ballad of the Blistered Toe. It was considered a success because nobody punched each other that night. You briefly consider proposing a revival. You wisely don't. By day 2, the bunkhouse is heavy with heat, smoke, and mood swings. Someone's making snow melt over the stove to drink because the water barrel's frozen solid. Someone else is insisting his bunk is sinking. The floor's giving out, he mutters. I can feel it. You check. It's fine. Probably. You pace. You try to read. You join a card game and lose 4 matches in a row, which gets you the honor of cleaning the chamber pot. A grim little corner bucket nobody talks about unless it's your turn. You handle it with tongs and a clothespin on your nose. This is not your finest moment. The scholarly debate around storm lock-ins focuses on their psychological toll. Were they a welcome break from the grind, or a test of mental endurance? Some historians argue it was the only time men could bond beyond work, telling stories, singing, even writing letters. Others describe them as emotional pressure cookers, where boredom curdled into irritability, and irritability into conflict. You've seen both unfold within hours. By the third night, nobody slept well. The stove creaks. The walls sweat from too much heat. A few men strip to their undershirts just to stop feeling like boiled potatoes. One guy insists it's too hot. Another swears he's freezing. The arguments begin with jokes, then jabs. Then someone threatens to toss a boot out the one tiny window. Tensions rise like smoke. And like smoke, they find every crack. You wisely keep your head down. You help melt snow. You stack kindling. You offer to read aloud from the one tattered almanac in camp. No one listens, but it distracts you. The men drift through the hours like ghosts, haunting their own bunkhouse. Conversations loop. Jokes recycle. It's like time has stopped and started again in a worse direction. The door, now half frozen shut, remains a symbol of your confinement. One guy keeps trying to open it every hour, like he's testing a jail cell. The snow on the other side presses back. It's a standoff. The door always wins, but it's not all bad. On the 4th day, when the snow finally stops, the light returns. It bounces through the window slits, bright and blue and sharp enough to cut. Someone laughs, not sarcastic, not manic, just laughs at the sight of it. Another starts humming. The mood shifts again, slowly, delicately, like a thaw. You all take turns shoveling the way out, digging through packed snow with shovels, pots, and bare hands. It takes hours. Your shoulders ache, your fingers burn, but the air feels clean. The forest reappears. Trees now glazed with frost stand still and bright. And for the first time in days, you feel like you're outside of something, like you've broken through. Inside the bunkhouse, the heat lingers. The smell of close quarters hangs in the air. Sweat, smoke, and stewed boredom. But there's something else now, too. Relief. You survived being trapped in a room with 20 other people and one bucket. And for a moment, that feels more impressive than felling a tree. The fire's steady again, boots are drying, and your arms are still sore from digging the bunkhouse door out of a snowbank the size of a sleeping mammoth. But you made it. The lock-in is over. The sky's back to its pale blue self, and the trees sparkle like they've been dusted with diamonds. Which would be more magical if you didn't know firsthand that diamonds melt faster than snow sticks to your eyebrows. After so many hours cooped inside with men slowly turning into animals, you finally get to breathe in something other than steamed sock vapor. That alone feels worth celebrating. And of course, nothing says we didn't kill each other like ghost stories. It starts with a whistle. Someone near the stove, whittling a spoon that now resembles a tooth, casually mentions the haunted sawmill he once worked at. You raise an eyebrow, but you don't say anything. You've learned better. In the bunkhouse, weird stories travel fast, and you never want to be the guy who laughs first, because that's usually the guy who ends up screaming in his bunk later when a log shifts the wrong way or a shadow crosses the window. And so it begins. The tale grows legs before it even finishes its first lap around the room. A saw that ran on its own. A worker who vanished one morning without a trace. Nothing left but his boots, neatly side by side. Whispers heard from the tool shed when no one was inside. You don't believe any of it, obviously, but the tone in the room changes. The light seems dimmer. Even the stove flickers in that weird, dramatic way fires do when they feel like helping with the atmosphere. Here's your historical fact. Logging camp folklore was a rich, sprawling world of myth, rumor, and shared fear. Tall tales weren't just entertainment. They were a cultural release valve. Ghost stories, forest spirits, cursed trees, haunted axes. Every region had its own favorites, passed down and reinvented by each new batch of men who spent long nights too wired to sleep and too cold to pretend they weren't listening. The second story of the night is worse. This time it's Eli, of course. He's always the guy with the extra gruesome version. He swears on his last pair of unchewed long johns that his uncle worked a camp where they buried a guy under the bunkhouse because it was too cold to dig a real grave, and they couldn't spare the manpower to haul the body out. They said the bunkhouse got louder after that, Eli mutters, eyes wide, like the snoring wasn't coming from the men. Someone snorts, someone else tells him to shut up. But no one leaves the stove. And here's the fringe fact. Some loggers swore by witness trees, old-growth giants said to carry the memory of the forest. Cut one down, and bad things would follow. Sudden equipment failure, random injuries, even madness. Whether it was superstition, or boredom, or an early understanding of ecological guilt, some men refused to touch certain trees, especially ones that seemed too still. Whatever that means, you haven't seen a tree move in weeks, and yet you still know what they're talking about. Tonight, the bunkhouse is unusually quiet. No card games, no brawls, just men half listening, half watching the way the shadows twitch on the ceiling. You try to shake it off. You're not a believer. You don't scare easy. But you also sleep with your axe under the bunk, blade pointed away, but ready just the same. The scholarly debate, unsurprisingly, isn't whether lumberjacks told stories. Of course they did. But why the stories so often focused on the eerie? Some researchers say it was about control. You can't stop a blizzard, or a falling tree, or a broken sled. But you can invent something spookier than all of it and laugh at it around the fire. Others suggest it was simply a way to cope with monotony, to keep the mind nimble when the body was broken. When your life is mostly chopping, eating, and trying not to freeze, a good ghost can be just what you need to feel alive. Someone throws another log on the fire, and sparks dance up the chimney. You roll your shoulders and glance at the door. Still shut. Still no signs of any wandering forest phantoms or bears. Honestly, you'd take a ghost over a bear any day. At least ghosts don't break ribs. Then comes the best part of any ghost story session: the one-upmanship. One man tells of a logging sled that kept rolling back up a hill. Another claims to have seen footprints that ended in the middle of a frozen pond. And then, inevitably, the debate begins. What's worse, haunted forests or haunted bunkhouses? You lean toward bunkhouses. At least with the woods, you expect to be afraid. The bunkhouse is supposed to be your last refuge, your cave, your shell, your slightly soggy sanctuary. But once you start imagining voices from the attic, which you don't have, or bunkmates who snore with no pulse, which you do worry about sometimes, the safety cracks just a little. Later that night, with the fire low and most men dozing off, you lie in your bunk and stare at the rafters. They creak. They always creak. But now the creaks seem rhythmic. 1, 2, 3 creaks, then silence, then a soft thud. You tell yourself it's the wood settling. You tell yourself it's snow sliding off the roof. You tell yourself it's not that story about the guy in the wall. You sleep anyway, because you're exhausted. But somewhere deep in your bones, you know that if anyone whispers your name from the corner tonight, you're swinging first and apologizing later. You never expected mail to matter so much. Back home, assuming you still remember where that is, letters were just things your mother sent full of guilt and stale news, or bills that demanded attention you didn't have. But here, in the belly of the forest, after weeks of white silence and the constant chorus of boots, 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 the idea of a letter is something else entirely. A miracle. A proof that somewhere out there, the world still spins, and people still say your name. It happens every few weeks, depending on the weather and whether the trail between your camp and the nearest town is passable without losing a horse, a sled, or a mail carrier's dignity. But when it does, when that tiny man in the oversized coat stomps into camp trailing steam and bad attitude, you'd think the president himself had arrived. Everyone stops. Men drop axes mid-swing. Someone cheers. Someone else nearly cries. Mail call begins. There's no ceremony to it. No roll call or formal announcements. Just a bent man with windburned cheeks flipping through a stack of wrinkled envelopes, calling out names like a carnival barker too tired to care. Mackenzie. A hand shoots up. Branford. Nothing. Branford? Still nothing. The envelope gets tucked back in the stack. Maybe next time. When he says your name, it takes you a second to react. You blink like someone slapped you. A letter? For you? You trudge forward, stunned, and take the thin, creased paper in your hands like it might shatter. It smells faintly of perfume. Or maybe it's just not smoke, and that alone makes it precious. You stuff it inside your coat and walk back to the bunkhouse slowly, afraid to open it too fast, like you'll run out of world the second the words hit your eyes. Here's your historical fact. For lumberjacks in remote winter camps, mail wasn't just a nicety, it was a lifeline. Letters brought news, jokes, updates on births and deaths, and most importantly, a tether to humanity. Camps often pooled money to pay the nearest town boy to carry messages in and out, sometimes on snowshoes, sometimes on sleighs. Some even tipped their cooks to sneak letters into outgoing supply sleds. It wasn't organized, but it was sacred. Inside the bunkhouse, everyone's doing the same thing, spreading paper out carefully, holding envelopes near the stove to soften them, reading slowly, out loud if it's good news, quietly, if it's not. You crack yours open with frozen fingers and start to read. It's from your sister, or your cousin, or maybe a friend's wife, someone who still remembers you by name and not just as that guy who went off into the woods to chop things and vanish. The handwriting is rough, but kind. There's mention of rain, of the town dog who still tries to bite strangers, of someone getting married, though you don't recognize the names. It doesn't matter. It's life. It's language. It's a voice from beyond the pines. And then, tucked at the end, 3 words that hit you harder than a falling pine. We miss you. You fold the letter slowly, press it to your chest, then immediately slide it into your sock for safekeeping. That's the official archive of the bunkhouse. The inside of your left boot. It's not elegant, but it's warm. Someone else isn't so lucky. Across the room, a man stares at his letter like it bit him. Then he folds it once, twice, stuffs it in his shirt pocket, and walks outside. No one follows. There's a silence that settles, not the awkward kind, but the respectful kind. Everyone knows better than to ask. You don't get to choose what's in a letter, only whether you open it. Here's your fringe fact. In some camps, mail sparked real drama. Fights broke out over shared sweethearts. One man received 2 letters in the same day, one from his wife and one from his mistress. He walked into the woods and wasn't seen until spring. Another man got dumped by telegram, which was then read aloud to the entire bunkhouse by a friend trying to be funny. He wasn't. That night, his boots mysteriously vanished into the stove. The scholarly debate around letters in logging camps is less about content and more about impact. Did regular mail boost morale, reduce desertion, improve mental health? Or did it make things worse by reminding men how far they were from the lives they once knew? Some say it gave them hope. Others say it made the walls of the bunkhouse feel even tighter. You suspect the truth is somewhere in between, like most things out here. A week passes, then 2. The letter in your sock starts to disintegrate around the edges from sweat and friction, but you can't bring yourself to move it. You've read it 20, maybe 30 times. It's memorized now. Sometimes you whisper the words to yourself when you're falling asleep. It's not much, but it's something. And then one night, during stew, someone asks if anyone wants to dictate a letter out. He's got a pencil nub and half a page of clean paper. A few guys grunt. One says, "Tell my ma I still got all my fingers." Another says, "Write to my dog. Tell him I didn't leave on purpose." Everyone laughs, but not for long. It turns quiet again. Heavy. You consider it. Then you don't. Not yet. But maybe soon. Because someday, the mail will come again. And when it does, you'll want someone out there to know that you're still alive, still swinging an axe, still fighting the cold, still trying to remember your middle name. Still here. You wouldn't think tin cans would be the foundation of innovation, but after enough weeks in a lumber camp bunkhouse, surrounded by limited supplies, excessive boredom, and the collective creative desperation of 24 grown men who've memorized every knot in the ceiling, tin cans become the answer to everything. Need a lantern? Tin can. Need a stove tool? Tin can. Need a cup, a funnel, a shovel, a lockbox, a musical instrument, a rodent trap, a conversation piece? Tin. Can. It starts when you finish a can of beans and hesitate before throwing it in the scrap pile. There's a quiet reverence in that hesitation now. You eye the empty can like it holds infinite potential, because it kind of does. Around you, men are already repurposing them, stacking, flattening, cutting them into strange shapes with knives that should probably not be involved in arts and crafts. The bunkhouse has slowly evolved into a workshop. Along one wall, someone's rigged a lantern out of a can, some soot-blackened glass, and a bootlace. It smokes like a chimney but gives off a warm, flickering glow. Another man has fashioned a spoon from a can lid and a bit of pine wood. Is it sharp? Yes. Is it dangerous? Also, yes. But it works, and that's all that matters. Here's your historical fact. Recycling, though no one called it that, was essential in logging camps. Supplies were expensive to transport and easy to ruin. So nothing got wasted. Food tins were hoarded and reshaped. Nails were pulled, straightened, reused. Old harness leather became hinges or drawer pulls. Even broken saws got filed down into scrapers or wedges. If it didn't rot or freeze solid, it found a second life. You've taken to modifying your bunk. Nothing fancy, just small improvements. You flattened a few tin lids and slid them under one corner to stop the eternal wobble. You crafted a hook from wire and nailed it above your head, perfect for hanging your gloves at night so they don't end up under someone else's boot. You're even thinking about carving a drawer into the wall for your letter, if you can trust anyone not to use it for jerky storage. And that brings us to your fringe fact. Some lumberjacks were amateur inventors. Entire camp legends formed around guys who jury-rigged complex contraptions from whatever they had on hand. One man reportedly built a rotating bunk warmer powered by the draft of the stove. Another crafted a rat-catching machine from tin cans, string, and a persuasive smell. He called it the Crit Raider. It allegedly caught 3 raccoons and a drunk bunkmate before being dismantled for parts. Of course, not all bunkhouse hacks are brilliant. One guy tries to build a steam hat, a can and cloth contraption he claims will dry his hair faster and protect his brain from frostbite. He places it over a hole in the stovepipe, waits 10 seconds, and then yelps loud enough to make the bunkhouse collectively flinch. The smell of scorched wool and pride hangs in the air for hours. Nobody speaks of it again. He now wears his hat inside out, for reasons best left undiscussed. And here's the open scholarly debate. Were these bunkhouse modifications a reflection of ingenuity born of hardship, or just a symptom of isolation slowly unraveling otherwise rational men? Some argue this creativity was key to morale, proof that even when stripped of comfort and convenience, people will find ways to shape the world around them. Others believe these behaviors were signs of mental exhaustion, like building castles out of crumbs. You think both arguments might be true, depending on how your fingers feel that morning, and whether your last attempt at making a knife sheath from birch bark ended in success or band-aids. Meanwhile, one bunkmate's crafting a chess set from carved sticks and tin slivers. The pieces are barely distinguishable, so he started painting them with soot and grease. The board is scratched into the bunkhouse floor with a nail. The game goes unfinished for days at a time, but everyone knows who's winning. Somehow. Then there's the bunkhouse mirror, a tin can lid, polished so carefully it reflects just enough light to show you the outline of your face. It hangs on the nail by the door, and men take turns squinting into it in the mornings, grooming beards or popping frost-nipped zits with quiet precision. No one talks about it, but everyone uses it. Once, someone made the mistake of adjusting its angle without permission. That night, the mirror disappeared. It was found hanging from a rafter 2 days later, turned to face the wall. Message received. Another man, named Cook, not the cook, just unfortunately named, starts constructing a shelf above his bunk made entirely of scrap wood, pine resin, and bent nails. It's beautiful in a dangerously unstable sort of way. He puts a single button on it. Just a button. No one asks why. He never explains. The button's still there. One evening, you watch as 2 men collaborate on what they call the can phone, a string tied between 2 large bean tins, stretched across the bunkhouse like a line of hope. They try it once. The result is mostly metallic hissing and one man yelling, "What?" repeatedly. But it draws laughs, real laughs. And for 10 whole minutes, the bunkhouse feels less like a drafty box full of snoring and pain and more like something almost human. You end the night by adjusting the tin reflector you've attached behind your bunk's candle stub. It throws more light upward now, just enough to let you scribble a few words onto your crumpled letter draft before the wax runs out. It's not art, but it's yours. And somehow, shaping this miserable little space into something slightly better makes the cold hurt less. Because that's what survival looks like out here. Not just eating and sleeping and chopping and not dying. It's also in the tiny victories. The tin can tweaks, the hook on the wall, the whittled spoon, the shelf with a single button. You lie back in your bunk, surrounded by smoke and coughs and invention, and feel, just barely, like you've made something out of nothing. Which, in this place, is everything. It begins with a soft creak, the kind you'd normally ignore. After all, the bunkhouse is made of creaks, walls that groan when the wind hits just right, bunks that squeal under the weight of exhausted men, the roof muttering to itself as it shifts beneath the snow's heavy breath. But this creak, this one's different. It's deeper, heavier, and it doesn't stop. You're sitting near the stove, fiddling with a bit of bent wire you've been meaning to turn into a boot hook, when the ceiling above you lets out a sound like an old tree splitting in half. Not the usual dry pop. This is a snap, a warning. You glance up. Everyone else does too. No one says a word. Then a chunk of snow the size of a laundry tub crashes past the window, shaking the whole frame. A few flakes tumble in through a crack above the door, riding the sudden gust of fear that blows through the bunkhouse. Now someone does speak. Just one word. Roof. The next few seconds are pure instinct. You all scatter. Not far, because there's nowhere to go in a room built for bodies, not movement. But everyone backs away from the center. Men dive from top bunks, boots half on, grabbing coats, yelling for shovels, yelling for anything. The stove shakes. The bunkhouse tilts, just slightly, like it's trying to shrug. Then it holds. And for a moment, there's silence. Then someone, probably Eli, says, "Well, that's not ideal." No kidding. Here's your historical fact. Snow load collapses were a very real danger in northern lumber camps. Bunkhouses, often built hastily and not meant for permanence, would accumulate snow by the ton. Without proper pitch or clearance, that weight could crush roofs like tin cans. Entire crews could be trapped, or worse. In 1894, a bunkhouse in Ontario folded inward during a thaw-freeze cycle, killing 2 men in their sleep and pinning 5 others under split timbers and burning coals. After that, many camps began sending crews up to shovel roofs between storms. Not out of regulation, out of fear. So guess what you're doing today? You drag the ladder from the tool shed, if it can be called that, and jam it against the icy logs of the outer wall. It's rickety. Everything is. You climb it anyway. One hand, then the other. The air up here bites harder than it does below, and the roof groans beneath your boots. But the snow is worse. It's not soft, not fluffy. It's layered ice, compacted until each shovelful weighs more than a newborn ox. You dig, and the roof answers with creaks of complaint. Others join you, 5, maybe 6 guys, spaced out along the ridge, each bundled in enough wool to look like walking hay bales, each one grumbling in sync. Nobody likes roof duty. It's dangerous, miserable. One wrong step and you're sliding off into the unknown. But it's necessary, and necessary wins every time out here. You find a rhythm. Scoop, throw, shift. Scoop, throw, shift. Below, the bunkhouse starts to look like an island in a sea of snow, the shoveled paths winding like tiny roads. Above, steam rises from your back. You forgot what sweating feels like when the air is this cold. It's almost relaxing, in that exhausting way only a lumber camp chore can be. Until someone yells. The snow near the far corner collapses underfoot, revealing a hidden dip in the roofline. A man named Jonas goes down to his knees, flailing, barely catching himself before he vanishes into the hole. Shouts echo. You rush over. He's okay. Shaken, muttering something about his foot being swallowed by a ghost, but otherwise fine. The bunkhouse, on the other hand, clearly isn't. Back inside, damage inspection begins. The ceiling near the stove sags just a bit more than usual. You poke at it with a broom handle. It moves. That's never comforting. A crack now runs the length of the far beam, like a grin stretched too wide. You trace it with your eyes, then your fingers, wondering just how much weight the roof can take before it decides it's had enough. Here's your fringe fact. Some loggers believed that hammering a horseshoe above the door kept the bunkhouse roof from collapsing. Others thought playing music during a storm lulled the wood, keeping it relaxed and pliable. One camp leader reportedly made his men whistle while they shoveled, claimed it kept the bunkhouse cheerful and standing. That camp lasted 3 seasons. The whistling did not. You suggest a support beam, maybe 2. Nobody argues. The bunkhouse isn't exactly OSHA compliant, but it's better than dying in your sleep under a pile of splinters and hot coals. You scavenge timber from the tool shed and a few fallen logs from near the latrine, wood that should have gone toward next week's fire. You notch it by hand, drag it inside, and help wedge it beneath the sagging joist. It takes 3 men to hammer it into place, and the moment it locks, the entire roof seems to breathe easier. Or maybe that's just you projecting. Either way, no one dies tonight. That's a win. The scholarly debate around bunkhouse collapse prevention is more practical than poetic. Were crews trained to recognize signs of structural fatigue, or did they just fix things after a close call? Some records show foremen assigning regular inspections. Others suggest most bunkhouses were left to the judgment of the men sleeping under them. When you consider how often judgment in the woods is clouded by cold, exhaustion, or stew-induced hallucinations, it's no wonder these places bent before they broke. That night, the mood is subdued. No card games, no fights, just quiet repair work, sealing drafts, reinforcing corners, making nervous jokes about ghosts with hammers. You sit by the stove, watching a droplet of meltwater slowly trail down the stovepipe, and try not to imagine what it would feel like if the entire roof gave out at 3 a.m. You sleep with your coat on, just in case you have to sprint into the snow. Again. But in the middle of the night, something happens. You don't wake to a crash or a scream. You wake to silence. The bunkhouse doesn't groan. It doesn't creak. It just holds, for now. The floor of the bunkhouse is more of a suggestion than a surface. It's made of rough-hewn planks, yes, but those planks have warped, cracked, buckled, and shifted under the pressure of heavy boots, tracked-in snow, dropped tools, spilled stew, and at least one small wrestling match over a harmonica debt. The result is a landscape that crunches, groans, and occasionally bites back. You don't walk across the bunkhouse floor so much as negotiate with it. This morning, you wake with a pine splinter in your heel and a fresh dusting of sawdust in your blanket fold. Not again. You swing your legs over the edge of your bunk and immediately regret not lacing your boots the night before. The floorboards are cold, truly cold, like kissing the mouth of a snowman who holds a grudge. You leap into your boots like a man dodging landmines, and still, you lose a toe's worth of feeling by the time you get them laced. The source of the sawdust becomes apparent immediately, the infamous sawdust shuffle. It's how every step in the bunkhouse sounds these days, thanks to the new cleaning initiative started by Eli after he slipped in someone's soup last week. His solution? Sawdust. Everywhere. Just throw it down and walk the dirt away. It's absurd, it's messy, and it works, mostly. Here's your historical fact. Sawdust was a universal fix-it material in logging camps. It was scattered on bunkhouse floors to soak up snowmelt, spilled food, blood from minor injuries, and whatever else found its way underfoot. It kept things dry and made sweeping easier. Some bunkhouses kept sacks of it by the door, constantly replenished by someone on bull cook duty who probably wished he'd gone into banking. You grab a broom, well, what used to be a broom. Now it's more of a stick with aspirations. You begin your morning sweep, pushing damp sawdust toward the stove corner. It's not elegant, it's not effective, but it's routine. Everyone does their part, eventually. A few guys turn it into a dance, stomping across the floor in rhythm, boots grinding the dust into every crevice. Someone hums. Someone else drops a shovel on their foot. Life continues. The bunkhouse floor tells stories, if you know how to look. Scrape marks where firewood was dragged. Burned spots from dropped coals. A dent near the stove that, legend says, came from a cook's pot flying across the room during a bean-fueled outburst. Even the planks themselves, uneven in size and color, hint at their makeshift origin. You know at least 3 came from an old outhouse wall. One has initials carved into it. No one knows whose. And here's your fringe fact. Some bunkhouses added straw or moss between floor planks for insulation. Others tried to build raised walkways inside, just a few inches off the base floor, to keep feet dry. These were affectionately called loft lanes. They worked great until someone tripped on them, face planted into a pile of socks, and swore vengeance on all elevated surfaces. Today, a new debate has emerged, whether to scrape the floor. A man named Bill, who claims he worked a fancy camp up north, says they used metal scrapers to chip away grime every week. He even produces a blade from his trunk, rusted but solid, and demonstrates by carving a neat strip of gunk from under the table. Everyone is impressed. No one wants to touch it. The scholarly debate on bunkhouse flooring is minor but telling. Some argue that poor floor maintenance led to illness, mold, parasites, bacteria, but others say the cold temperatures and near constant dryness from stove heat kept things surprisingly sanitary, if not exactly pleasant. What everyone agrees on is this: you don't walk barefoot, not even once. By midday, the floor has been shuffled, swept, and cursed into relative tidiness. You kneel to reset a loose board near your bunk and find a button. Not yours. Possibly from a coat lost last season. Possibly from a man who no longer works here, or no longer lives here. You pocket it anyway. You've got a little collection now. Odds and ends, tiny bunkhouse treasures, a snapped pencil stub, a rusted nail twisted into a spiral, one single domino with no set to match. Strange how living in filth makes you notice the beauty in trash. Outside, it starts to snow again. Not much, just enough to track in with every boot that crosses the threshold. The door slams open. Gust of wind, flurry of snow, one man yelling for help with a sleigh load, and suddenly all your work is undone. The floor is chaos again. Wet sawdust, dropped mittens, boot prints heading in every direction like a herd of confused buffalo. You shrug. You pick up the broom. Again. That's the rhythm here. Sweep. Track. Shovel. Spill. Repeat. That night, you lie in your bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the floor will look like in the morning. It changes shape overnight, warps with heat, swells with snowmelt, and every morning, it groans like it's just as tired as you are. but it's your floor. Your crusty, sticky, creaky plank runway through winter's waiting room. And when you close your eyes, you swear you can hear it whisper, "Another day survived, one splinter at a time." The thaw sneaks in like a liar, slow, uncertain, a little too hopeful to trust. It begins with sound, not sight, drips off the eaves, soft plunks as snow lets go of the roof, a distant shh as the wind changes its tone from icy hiss to something more like a sigh. You crack the bunkhouse door one morning and nearly stumble at the scent in the air. It doesn't smell like pine smoke or frozen wool anymore. It smells wet, like the forest finally exhaling after holding its breath all winter. Spring isn't here exactly, but it's whispering through the branches. With it comes a new rhythm in camp. The days stretch longer. The men move faster, like they've been wound up too tight, and suddenly there's room to breathe again. Snow melts into slush. Slush turns into puddles. Puddles into lakes. The bunkhouse shifts from a winter fort into a kind of swamp raft, half floating on mud, held together by nails and stubbornness. The roof leaks. Again. You wake up one morning to a steady drip, drip, drip landing on your blanket. You roll over. Another drop hits your cheek. Your body reacts before your brain does, kicking you out of bed and onto the now soggy floor with a thud. Water from the melting snowpack above has found its way through the cracks, soaked the moss, and decided to build a colony in your top bunk. You spend the next hour patching the ceiling with a hunk of tarp and some wax-soaked cloth you'd been saving for emergencies. Apparently, now qualifies. Here's your historical fact. Most bunkhouses weren't designed for longevity. By the time the thaw arrived, many had started to crumble at the seams. Logs shifted, roofs sagged. Ice that had glued everything solid now melted, revealing just how jerry-rigged the whole operation had been. Spring meant collapse, cleanup, and eventually, dismantling. A bunkhouse was only meant to last a season. After that, the forest began reclaiming it, one trickle of water at a time. You start noticing little goodbyes. One guy begins packing his things, his spare socks, his whetstone, a wooden figure he carved during the snowstorm lock-in. Another finally throws out his one-eyed mittens and announces he'll be wearing real gloves again by May. It feels premature. The snow still lingers in the shadows, but there's something in the air now. A promise. The cook starts serving lighter meals, almost like he's anticipating the end. Fewer beans, more bread. You overhear talk of summer plans, returning home, joining another camp further north, maybe even doing nothing at all. "I might fish for 3 months straight," one man mutters, leaning back from the table with molasses in his beard. "Or sleep. Or both." The bunkhouse begins to empty itself gradually. Not in bodies, everyone's still here, but in spirit. Socks don't hang to dry quite as often. No one bothers fixing the broken nail in the far bench anymore. That chess game scratched into the floor. Abandoned mid-match. The queen went missing, likely stepped on, likely tossed into the stove. No one complains. Everyone's mind is somewhere else. On dirt roads, riverboats, front porches, clean beds. And here's the fringe fact. Some camps had a send-off ritual for the bunkhouse itself. The last night before disbanding, men would gather to burn scraps, drink whatever was left of the good stuff, and carve their initials into the wall above their bunks. In some abandoned cabins still standing today, those initials can still be found, faded but proud. A sort of grave marker for the season. You catch yourself tracing a design into the log by your own bunk. Absent-mindedly at first. A symbol, a date, a name that still matters to you, even after months of smoke and snow and sleepless nights. You don't carve it. Not yet. But you think about it. The scholarly debate around seasonal transitions in logging camps focuses on how the men handled reintegration into normal life. Some claim the thaw caused emotional unease, men becoming restless, reckless, or melancholic at the thought of leaving behind the strange fraternity formed in the cold. Others argue most were eager to forget it all and rejoin civilization. But every memoir, every scrap of journal, seems to carry that same undertone. Leaving the woods doesn't feel quite as good as you expect. Today, your job is dismantling the woodpile. What was once the beating heart of the bunkhouse, the fuel for every fire, the warmth that kept you human, is now a stack of damp logs and scattered splinters. Some pieces are rotten, some are still frozen solid. You sort them anyway, piling the salvageable ones under a tarp for next season. The rest, you burn. Not for heat, but for closure. Inside the bunkhouse has started to echo again. With fewer wet boots clomping around, fewer pots clanging, and less shouting over who stole whose gloves, the place sounds hollow. You hadn't noticed how much noise made it feel full. That night, someone proposes a last bunkhouse feast. The cook digs deep into the stores. Salt pork, flour, canned peaches, saved for something special. And the room buzzes with energy you haven't felt since before the worst of the cold. You eat like kings, laughing with mouths full, drinking from mismatched mugs, listening to one last harmonica tune that sounds suspiciously like the same song he's been playing since December. You lie in your bunk afterward, full and tired, boots already packed. You run your fingers over the grain of the log beside your head and think about carving something after all. Not for anyone else, just for yourself. A record, a mark that says, I was here. I made it. Outside, the snow melts a little faster. Inside, the bunkhouse dreams its last few dreams. Soon, this place will be empty. But tonight, it's still yours. No one really wants to talk about it, but the haunted bunkhouse exists. It's not your bunkhouse. Thank whatever frozen forest gods still look out for lumber-sore shoulders and half-frozen brains. But it's close, less than a day's sled ride, tucked deeper into the pine-thick stretch just north of the ravine. You didn't even know it was there until Jonas, the same man who once tried to invent snowproof matches with wax and a bad attitude, started whispering about it over dinner. Just dropped it into conversation between bites of pork and whatever stew, like he was mentioning the weather. They left it, he said, spoon tapping his bowl. Mid-season. Left everything. Tools, coats, even a kettle still on the stove. Said it weren't safe no more. At first, no one responded. Then Eli snorted and said, You mean they left 'cause their roof caved in? Nope, Jonas replied. Roof's still there. I seen it. And just like that, the haunted bunkhouse was back in circulation. The story changes depending on who tells it. Some say a man died in his bunk, and no one noticed for 3 days, until the stink started curling toes. Others claim it was a murder. One bunkmate took an axe to another after a bad hand of cards, and no one ever found the body. The real spine-crawling version, though, the one that sticks in your head long after the fires died down, goes like this. They found something in the woods one night, something old. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a man, just something. After that, nothing felt right in camp. Men stopped sleeping. Tools went missing. One morning, all the saws were found bent into circles like a blacksmith had a tantrum. Then someone tried to burn the bunkhouse. It didn't catch. So they left. Here's your historical fact. Bunkhouses, like any hastily built structure in the deep woods, didn't always last. Some were abandoned mid-season due to flooding, fire, bad lumber runs, or financial collapse. But others, scattered and scarce, were left under stranger circumstances. Oral histories from Maine, Michigan, and parts of Quebec include references to cursed camps where men refused to stay after certain events. These stories never made it into official ledgers, but they lived on in whispers. One man in your camp, older, quiet, built like a knot of hickory, claims he spent one night in that bunkhouse. He says he didn't sleep, that the walls whispered all night long, that someone walked past his bunk every 20 minutes. Heavy steps, no voice, just boots on wood. He was the only man in the room. Someone laughs nervously. Maybe it was your heartbeat. The old man doesn't smile, just says, "Then I got a heartbeat with frostbite and a pair of steel-toed boots." That night, the bunkhouse is too quiet. Every creak feels suspicious. Someone knocks over a boot, and half the room jerks awake. You keep your back to the wall. Not because you believe in ghosts exactly, but because you've seen what this place does to the mind. Cold gets in your bones, but loneliness, it seeps deeper. Here's your fringe fact. A few remote camps had bunkhouses that were formally avoided, even after being rebuilt. The trees around them grew stunted. Tools rusted faster. Stories of bad places were treated with cautious respect. In one bizarre case, a camp was moved half a mile just to avoid rebuilding on the same ground. The old bunkhouse stood empty for years until a forest fire finally took it. The scholarly community argues over this kind of thing. Were these tales just psychological reactions to harsh conditions and prolonged isolation? Was it cabin fever amplified by shared fear? Or did something deeper fuel these persistent superstitions? There's a theory that humans, when removed from civilization for too long, start assigning personality to the wilderness. Not just awe, but intent. The woods stop being background and become aware. That theory makes your skin crawl a little. A week after Jonas's story, a small group decides to see the haunted bunkhouse for themselves. They leave early, taking sleds and supplies. You don't go. You don't say why. You just don't. You sit by the stove that night and try not to imagine what they'll find, or what might follow them back. They return late, snowy, tired, faces unreadable. They don't speak much. Eli tries asking what they saw. No one answers. But the next day, one of them carves a symbol into the beam above his bunk. Something circular, something looping back into itself. You ask what it means. He just shrugs. Felt right. And that's the last anyone mentions the haunted bunkhouse. You go back to chopping. Back to splitting wood, cleaning your bunk, boiling your socks. But sometimes, when the wind howls a certain way through the trees at night, it sounds like words. Not your language. Not any language. Just syllables built from ice and loneliness. You lie in your bunk, staring at the rafters, wondering how long it takes a place to become haunted. Wondering if it's about death, or just memory. Because you've seen things, heard things, felt cold where there shouldn't be cold, laughed a little too hard just to shake off the feeling that something was watching, and you're not even sure what's scarier, the idea that a bunkhouse could be haunted, or the idea that this one already is. The old ways are coming back, just not quite how you remember them. It starts when a crew of reenactors shows up one morning, puffed up with bravado and Instagram ambitions, their boots barely scuffed and their flannels still crisp, like they were ironed over a campfire. They spill out of a wagon that's been modified to look period authentic and immediately start posing beside axes they haven't swung and trees they have no intention of felling. You watch from a distance, coffee in hand, face expressionless. You've seen trees smarter than this group. They're here to recreate the experience of a real winter logging camp. Or so they tell anyone who'll listen, which, frankly, is nobody. They've brought cameras, notebooks, a drone, which they claim is just for orientation, and an idea of bunkhouse life that seems to have been based entirely on sepia-toned photos and daydreams. You don't judge them, not too harshly, but you know what's coming. It always plays out the same way. Here's your historical fact. During the 20th century, especially after logging became more mechanized and less personal, a romantic view of the old lumberjack lifestyle emerged in pop culture. Festivals, reenactments, even old-timer storytelling circuits helped preserve the memory, but also softened it. The brutal realities of bunkhouse life, cold, injury, isolation, boredom, got tucked behind tales of brawny men and tall trees. Reality got mythologized. The reenactors out here now, they're part of that long tradition, though perhaps with more camera equipment and fewer blisters. Within an hour, their cheerful energy starts to fray. One guy has frost-nipped fingers from forgetting to dry his gloves. Another is whimpering quietly over a splinter in his palm. Someone tried to light a fire with birch bark and a smile. Someone else brought sustainable granola instead of beans, and now everyone hates him. A woman bundled in what looks like a fashion-forward sleeping bag stares at the bunkhouse with genuine horror. Is this where they slept? You smile into your coffee. They start asking questions. Too many. What did you use for pillows? You didn't. How long did a bunkhouse last? Not long. Were there ever women in the camps? Rarely, and usually only as cooks. Did people really go months without bathing? You nod solemnly and take another sip. They look vaguely ill. Here's your fringe fact. In some 21st century recreations of logging life, people have tried to live for a week, or even a month, using only tools and methods from the 1880s. Most fail after 3 days. One group made it 6 before frostbite, and interpersonal disputes over porridge forced them to pack it in. The longest record was 20 days, and even then, their bunkhouse had insulation and discreet Wi-Fi. You offer to show them how the stove works. They accept, gratefully. You open the firebox, prod the coals, shovel in some dry wood, and give the bellows a few patient pumps. The flame catches like it's missed you. A few of the group huddle close, their confidence dripping away with the melting snow on their sleeves. They try to sleep in the bunkhouse that night. You know because you hear them tossing and turning. One guy mutters about something crawling on his blanket. Another complains the stove is too hot. Then it's too cold. One brave soul attempts the top bunk and spends the whole night groaning with every creak of the rafters. Someone, probably granola guy, snores with the stuttering drama of a man dying in slow motion. By morning, they're pale-eyed and glassy. You ask how it went. No one meets your gaze. One girl says, "I think I slept on a nail." Another adds, "Something bit me, and I don't want to know what." You nod. Welcome to the club. They last 2 more nights. By the end, their flannel is filthy. Their camera batteries are dead, and the bunkhouse looks like it's chewed them up and spit out the clean parts. Before leaving, they gather their things, silently. No speeches, no summary reflections. One guy does carve his initials into the bunk post. Another takes a charcoal rubbing of the stovepipe. A few offer thanks, half sincere, half traumatized. Then, as they load their wagon and roll out, someone turns and asks, "Why'd you stay?" Like, why would anyone do this for real? You pause. You could explain the pay, the escape, the sense of freedom in the woods, the brotherhood that forms when the world forgets you exist and you're left only with each other and a stack of trees to destroy. But instead you say, it teaches you what matters. When nothing's easy, everything means more. They stare for a moment. then nod, and leave. Here's the scholarly debate. Is modern reenactment a form of historical preservation or performance tourism? Some argue it cheapens the experience, reducing real hardship into cosplay. Others claim it's a way to connect, to walk, or stumble in the boots of those who came before. You think the truth, like a lot of things out here, sits in the gray space in between. Later that evening, the bunkhouse feels oddly still. No rustle of high-tech sleeping bags. No whispered complaints about the lack of Wi-Fi. Just the familiar crackle of the fire, the occasional cough, the quiet shuffle of men who've earned their discomfort. You lie back in your bunk, arms behind your head, and wonder what the reenactors will remember. Will they recall the blisters, the biting cold, the way the stove glowed like a promise in the dark? Or will they tell stories about how they could have made it if they'd had one more pair of wool socks? Either way, you're glad they came. Because now they know the bunkhouse isn't just a place, it's a test. And most people fail it. The bunkhouse is quiet again, not in the usual dead of night way, but in the way that comes right before something ends. There's a particular stillness in the walls, like they know. Like the logs, the nails, the smoky old stove have all sensed that their time is up and are politely waiting to exhale. You've felt this kind of silence before. In schoolrooms after final exams, in church pews when the sermon ends, and now here, in the heart of a shack that somehow sheltered you through the worst winter of your life. You wake early, not from cold or noise, but because something inside you can't sleep. The others are still out, most of them anyway. One man is already packing. Another is outside, probably saying a long goodbye to the outhouse. You sit up, stretch, and let your boots hit the warped, splinter-strewn floor one last time. Today, the bunkhouse gets dismantled. It doesn't happen ceremoniously. There's no speech, no salute, no final whistle. Just tools in hand, a few tired grunts, and the weight of knowing what to take down and what to leave behind. You start by pulling your own things together. Coat, gloves, that warped spoon you whittled in January, the half-crushed tin lantern you swore you'd fix and never did, and of course, the letter. You've kept it safe all season. It still smells like smoke, but it's yours. Here's your historical fact. At the end of a logging season, bunkhouses were often broken down or abandoned. If the camp planned to return the following year, they might leave them standing, boarded up and locked. If not, the buildings were torn apart, the lumber salvaged, nails pulled, even the stove hauled out if it was worth anything. Bunkhouses weren't built to last. They were built to end. And you feel that ending in every board you lift, every nail you pry from the wall. The bunkhouse groans in protest, like it doesn't want to go. But it doesn't fight you. Not really. It just lets go. Eli finds a mouse nest in the rafters, complete with stolen thread and one extremely chewed up sock. He lifts it out like it's a fragile artifact. "It's art," he says solemnly, and someone nearby mutters, "Better than your singing." You laugh because you've survived the kind of winter that makes laughter feel like a miracle. And the bunkhouse has been the stage, the prison, the temple for all of it. Outside, the snow is mostly gone, replaced by wet earth and hopeful weeds. The trees look different now, not menacing, just tall and bored. The sun stays longer each day. Even the wind has lost its bite. You shed your coat by noon, sweat soaking your shirt as you hammer the last of the roof slats loose. That's when someone suggests it, marking the bunkhouse before it disappears entirely. Not a monument exactly, more like a message. One by one, the men begin carving names into what's left of the central beam. Initials, symbols, dates. You wait your turn, unsure of what to say, In the end, you settle for your name and a crude sketch of a bunk, one with a small circle above it. Your lantern. It's simple. It's enough. Here's your fringe fact. Some former loggers returned years later to visit the ruins of their bunkhouses, only to find their initials still there. Others discovered carvings they hadn't made, added later by people who had no business being there. Hikers, poachers, wanderers who found shelter in a structure built by ghosts. In at least one case, a bunkhouse long thought burned to the ground was found nearly intact, inhabited by a family of foxes and a single abandoned harmonica. The scholarly debate on bunkhouse preservation is as muddied as spring thaw. Some argue these buildings should be saved as part of labor history, testaments to a vanished world. Others say letting them rot is fitting, part of the natural cycle of frontier life. After all, nothing out here was meant to stay. The trees grow back. The roads disappear. Even the names fade. Only the stories remain, told in campfire smoke and bunkhouse breath. You take one last walk through the place before it's gone for good. Past the stove that dried your socks and warmed your bones. Past the bunk where someone snored like a dying elk for 3 straight months. Past the hook you hammered into the wall for your gloves. The beam you leaned against while pretending you weren't freezing, and the corner where you almost fought someone over stew. You run your fingers over the cracked window frame, over the ridge where frost used to gather thick as butter, and think, this was home. Not forever, but long enough to matter. You load the last of your things onto the sled. The bunkhouse, now half dismantled, leans like an old man. You turn back once more. No one says goodbye, but everyone feels it. The season is over. The cold is leaving. The trees are still standing. And you? You've changed. Harder in places, maybe. Softer in others. Smarter. Hungrier. And less afraid. Because in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but sweat and stubbornness and 20 other frost-bitten souls, you built something real. Something warm. Something you'll carry for the rest of your life, no matter how far you walk away. That was the bunkhouse. That was you. So now you're back where you started. Sort of. You're no longer in the bunkhouse, not physically anyway. The snow's long melted. The aches have dulled. Your coat doesn't always smell like smoke. But there's a version of you still up there in the woods, half shadowed by pine trees, feet thawing by the stove, a tin cup in your hand, and a letter tucked inside your sock. That version lingers. Maybe always will. Because something happens when you live through that kind of cold, that kind of close-quartered chaos. You come back changed. Not in the loud ways, but in the quiet ones. You notice the feel of a dry blanket. You appreciate the taste of hot stew that isn't gray. You watch the wind in the trees with a little more suspicion and maybe a little more respect. The bunkhouse was never meant to last. Just walls, a stove, some bunks, and a door that didn't quite shut. But what it held, that lasted. Brotherhood, grit, the terrible snoring of men who hadn't bathed in a month. The laughter of a joke so bad it looped back into brilliance. The crackle of the fire on a night so cold you forgot your name. The kind of memory that carves itself into the grain of your bones. So if you ever hear someone talk about the good old days in the lumber camps, nod, smile, let them have their legend. But know the truth. It wasn't the logs or the axes or even the trees that made it real. It was the bunkhouse and the people inside it. Thanks for sticking with me through the snowdrifts, the ghost stories, the stew disasters, and the steam hats. Sleep easy tonight, warm and safe and slightly more grateful for your mattress.